In the summer of 1904, New York was rocked by a scandal so explosive it threatened the reputations of the city's most powerful men. A white millionaire, one of the richest businessmen of his time, stood before the courts and made an unthinkable claim. He said a woman had ruined him. Not just any woman, a black woman. A woman few people had ever seen, who lived behind locked doors, surrounded by servants, property deeds, and a fortune worth nearly $30 million in today's money. Her name was Hannah Elias, and according to him, she had blackmailed him for nearly 20 years, bleeding him dry to protect a secret that could destroy his legacy. But here's the question no one could answer. If Hannah Elias was once a penniless servant girl, how did she become one of the richest women in America? And if she really was a criminal, why did the police let her walk free? This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about power, race, desire, and a city terrified of what it couldn't control. Because when the truth finally surfaced, New York realized something chilling. The real scandal wasn't what Hannah Elias did. It was who was afraid of her. The summer of 1904 settled over New York City like a fever. Heat rose from the cobblestones, clung to brick walls, and seeped into drawing rooms where powerful men read the morning papers with uneasy hands. Carriages rattled past newspaper boys shouting headlines that grew louder with each passing day. Something was wrong. Something had cracked beneath the polished surface of America's richest city. By July, the name was everywhere. Hannah Elias. Until then, almost no one outside a narrow circle of businessmen, landlords, and discreet servants had ever heard it. She did not attend society galas. She did not give interviews. She did not chase recognition. And yet, suddenly, she was impossible to escape because a man had spoken. John R. Platt, millionaire, glass magnate, respected patriarch of New York commerce, had gone to the authorities with an accusation so shocking it felt unreal even as it was printed in ink. He claimed he had been ruined. For nearly 20 years, Platt said, he had been extorted, bled slowly, forced to hand over enormous sums of money under threat of exposure. The total, he alleged, exceeded $685,000, a figure so staggering it made clerks stop counting and readers reread the line twice. And the woman he blamed? Not a rival tycoon, not a foreign banker, not a criminal syndicate, a black woman, a woman who lived quietly behind the doors of an elegant townhouse near Central Park, a woman who employed maids and butlers, a woman who owned property across Manhattan and Queens, a woman whose wealth, until now, had been whispered about but never openly challenged. Platt told police that Hannah Elias had threatened to destroy him, his marriage, his reputation, his standing, unless he paid her, month after month, year after year. He said he had no choice. New York froze. The accusation collided violently with everything the city believed about itself, about race, about power, about who could dominate whom. The newspapers wasted no time. They described Hannah Elias as mysterious, exotic, dangerous. Some papers questioned her origins. Others questioned her morality. Many questioned her very right to possess wealth at all. Few questioned Platt's motives, at least not at first. To the public, the story seemed irresistible, an aging white millionaire ensnared by a cunning woman of color who had somehow climbed from obscurity into unimaginable luxury. But the story refused to behave. Reporters who attempted to interview Hannah found nothing. No confessions, no dramatics, no panic. She remained silent. Her lawyers spoke carefully. Her house stayed closed. And then came the detail that unsettled everyone. When police investigated Platt's claims, they found no forged notes, no threats, no evidence of coercion, no letters demanding payment, no proof of blackmail at all. What they did find were records, meticulous, consistent, undeniable, checks, transfers, property purchases, all voluntarily signed, all spanning decades. If Hannah Elias had been extorting John R. Platt, she had done so without leaving a single fingerprint of force, and that raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If Platt had given her the money willingly, why had he done it? The city leaned in. Behind the headlines, fear brewed, not of crime, but of implication. If a black woman could amass such wealth not by inheritance, not by marriage, but through intelligence, discretion, and proximity to power, then the carefully maintained hierarchy of New York society looked far less stable than anyone cared to admit. For many, Hannah Elias was not frightening because she might be guilty. She was frightening because she might be innocent, and because her existence exposed something New York had worked very hard to keep hidden. That desire, hypocrisy, and money moved far more freely behind closed doors than public morality ever allowed. As July turned into August, the scandal grew teeth. Editorials sharpened, rumors spread, old men whispered in clubs, families argued behind dining room doors about inheritances that no longer existed, and at the center of it all sat Hannah Elias, unseen, unheard, and unmoved. A woman who had once been poor, a woman who had once been invisible, now accused of being too powerful for comfort. But this was only the beginning, because to understand why New York feared Hannah Elias in 1904, one had to go back nearly 40 years to a different city, a different America, and a girl born at the exact moment a nation was trying to stitch itself back together. That story did not begin with scandal. It began with survival. By the time John R. Platt's accusation became public, it was already too large to contain. What began as a private complaint, quietly delivered to authorities, mutated into a civic spectacle. The figure alone ensured that $685,000. In an era when a skilled worker might earn a few $100s a year, the sum bordered on the obscene. Newspapers adjusted it, inflated it, contextualized it, until readers could grasp its weight. Tens of millions in today's money. Enough to buy entire city blocks. Enough to fund dynasties. And according to Platt, every dollar had been taken from him under threat. The narrative was simple. Almost too simple. Platt claimed that years earlier, he had made a terrible mistake. One moment of weakness that Hannah Elias had turned into a lifelong weapon. She had demanded silence payments. He said, if he stopped paying, she would reveal everything to his family and the public, his visits, his desires, his shame. The story spread because it fit what people already wanted to believe. A powerful white man undone not by greed or foolishness, but by temptation. A black woman recast as manipulative, predatory, dangerous. The racial undertones were impossible to miss, even when they went unspoken. But as investigators began to examine the claim, the foundation cracked almost immediately. There was no trail of fear, no letters demanding money, no threats written in anger, no witnesses who had heard Hannah make demands, no evidence of urgency or escalation. Instead, there were patterns. Platt had paid her consistently, methodically, often generously beyond any supposed demand. Sometimes he had sent money when no contact had occurred for months. Other times, he had increased the amount without being asked. This was not the behavior of a man under siege. This was the behavior of a man choosing to give. The police found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Platt was wealthy, respected, and elderly. Hannah Elias was a Black woman with a past that could easily be weaponized against her. On paper, the choice of whom to believe should have been obvious, but the paper refused to cooperate as days passed. The city's fascination intensified, not because clarity was emerging, but because certainty was evaporating. The scandal had slipped from moral outrage into something far more dangerous: ambiguity. Who was exploiting whom? Platt's family soon entered the picture, and with them came urgency. Once the scale of his financial gifts became undeniable, panic spread through his household. Inheritance calculations collapsed overnight. Decades of assumed wealth had vanished into real estate, bank accounts, and assets bearing a woman's name, a woman they had never acknowledged, never approved, never imagined could exist on such equal footing. Pressure mounted. If the law could not prove blackmail, then the law would be pushed to reinterpret generosity as coercion. The courts became the stage where motives were dissected and reputations gambled. And Hannah Elias? She said nothing. When police approached her for questioning, she refused. When reporters camped near her residence, the doors remained closed. When whispers accused her of manipulation, she did not rise to defend herself. Her silence enraged people. To many, it read as arrogance. To others, as guilt. Few considered the possibility that silence was the only power left to a woman who knew exactly how the world listened and how it twisted what it heard. Inside her townhouse, life continued with deliberate calm. Servants came and went. Accounts were managed. Property rents collected. Hannah Elias did not flee. She did not hide. She did not behave like someone expecting collapse. That, perhaps, was what unsettled New York most of all. Because if she were guilty, she should have been afraid. And if she were innocent, then the city was staring at a far more uncomfortable truth. The accusation had already done its damage. It had exposed how fragile reputation truly was, and how quickly wealth could turn from admiration into suspicion when held by the wrong hands. By late summer, it was clear that this case was no longer about one man's claim or one woman's defense. It had become a referendum on race, power, and desire in a city built on all three. And still, the most important question remained unanswered. Not how Hannah Elias had taken the money, but why John R. Platt had given it year after year, long before anyone forced him to speak. To find that answer, the story had to move backward, back past the courtrooms and headlines, back before the money, back before New York, back to a child born in '65, in a country that had just learned how to end a war, but not how to heal from it. What unsettled New York most about Hannah Elias was not the accusation itself. It was that no one knew where to put her. She did not fit the familiar categories the city relied on to make sense of people like her. She was not visibly desperate, not loud, not reckless, not pleading. She did not behave like a woman caught in a scandal, nor like someone scrambling to protect stolen wealth. Instead, she existed in contradiction. Hannah Elias lived in a refined townhouse just steps from Central Park, an address that spoke a language New York understood very well. Money lived there. Respectability lived there. Power lived there. Yet the woman behind the door was someone society insisted should not belong. Reporters who managed to glimpse her described a figure that confounded expectations. She dressed conservatively. She spoke little. Her manner was calm, even distant. There were no extravagant jewels on display. No dramatic scenes played out for sympathy. Her wealth announced itself quietly, through property deeds, furnishings, and the disciplined rhythm of a household run with precision. This only deepened suspicion. The public wanted spectacle. They wanted excess. They wanted a villain they could recognize. When Hannah refused to perform that role, Imagination rushed in to fill the gap. Some papers claimed she was foreign-born. Others speculated she was Cuban, or from the Caribbean, anything to distance her from American soil. American systems. American responsibility. It was easier to believe she had come from elsewhere than to accept that the country itself had produced her. Race hovered over every paragraph written about her. Even when it went unmentioned, words like unnatural, mysterious, and unaccountable appeared with alarming frequency. Her wealth was treated not as an achievement, but as a provocation. How could a black woman possess so much without deception? How could she live so well without permission? The deeper investigators dug, the less criminal Hannah appeared, and the more unsettling her competence became. She owned properties in desirable neighborhoods. She managed rentals efficiently. Her finances were organized, deliberate, and forward-looking. There was no evidence of impulsive spending, no signs of sudden acquisition followed by collapse. This was not stolen money squandered. This was wealth maintained. Behind closed doors, city officials and businessmen whispered anxiously. The scandal had begun to touch nerves it was never meant to reach. If Platt had truly been manipulated, the law could respond. But if he had willingly financed Hannah's rise, guided it, even then the implications were far more dangerous. It suggested collaboration. It suggested intimacy. It suggested that the rigid boundaries New York claimed to uphold were already being crossed, quietly and repeatedly, by the very men who enforced them. Hannah's silence became a mirror. Those who despised her saw guilt reflected back. Those who feared her saw exposure. Those who studied her saw something rarer still: control. She had survived long enough to understand when speaking only fed the fire. She let the city argue with itself, let Platt's words unravel under scrutiny, let the absence of proof speak louder than any defense. And slowly, something shifted. The question stopped being, what did Hannah Elias do? It became, how did she get here? Because a woman did not materialize at the center of a scandal fully formed. She was shaped by systems, by rejection, by choices made under pressure long before the city ever learned her name. The newspapers, sensing this hunger, began to dig backward. They searched census records, court documents, old addresses, any trace of a past that could explain the present. What they found was not a criminal mastermind. It was a girl born in Philadelphia in 1865, the same year cannons fell silent and a fractured nation tried to redefine freedom. A girl raised in a large household, neither rich nor destitute. A girl who had once worked as a domestic servant in the home of a wealthy woman. A girl who had made one mistake, small, human, and unforgivable in the world she lived in. And that mistake had followed her. Long before New York accused Hannah Elias of wielding power. The world had taught her what powerlessness felt like. It had taught her how quickly dignity could be stripped away, how swiftly judgment could replace understanding, and how thin the line was between survival and condemnation. The scandal of 1904 did not create Hannah Elias. It merely revealed her. And to understand why she never begged, never confessed, never collapsed under pressure, one had to go back to the moment her life first turned, when admiration became accusation, when address became evidence, and when the justice system taught her a lesson she would never forget. That story began not in New York, but in Philadelphia, and it would change everything. Hannah Elias entered the world in 1865, the same year the American Civil War ended. It was a year heavy with symbolism, celebrated in history books as a moment of rebirth, yet lived by millions as a time of uncertainty. The war had ended, but freedom arrived unevenly, wrapped in conditions and contradictions. For Black families across the country, survival still depended less on promises and more on adaptation. Hannah was born in Philadelphia, a city that liked to think of itself as progressive, orderly, and forward-looking. Compared to the violence of the South, it was safer. Compared to true equality, it was still rigidly constrained. Her father, Charles Elias, was a cook and caterer, a man who worked long hours in white households and public events, feeding people who would never sit at his table. He was of mixed African American and Native American heritage, a detail that carried quiet weight in a society obsessed with classification. Hannah's mother, Mary Elias, was light-skinned as well, a woman whose appearance allowed her to pass unnoticed in some spaces and scrutinized in others. Together, they raised 9 children. The Elias household was crowded, loud, and disciplined. There was little room for indulgence, but there was order. Charles was respected within Philadelphia's Black community. Known as reliable and ambitious, he believed deeply in progress, slow, careful, respectable progress. Education mattered, reputation mattered, appearance mattered. They lived in what was considered one of the city's most prosperous African American neighborhoods, an area home to Black professionals, business owners, and skilled laborers. It was not wealth in the grand sense, but it was stability, something many families never achieved. Hannah grew up watching the careful choreography of respectability. She saw how her parents dressed when leaving the house, how they spoke differently to employers than to neighbors, how mistakes were not treated as learning experiences, but as threats. Her lighter skin made her noticeable from an early age. It was not a shield, at least not yet, but it was something adults commented on, something that drew eyes and assumptions. Hannah learned quickly that appearance shaped expectation, and expectation shaped consequence. She absorbed these lessons silently, the way children do, long before they have language for them. The Elias children attended public school. Their education was modest, but real. Hannah learned to read, to write, to observe. She was not described as rebellious or wild. If anything, she was quiet, attentive in ways that made adults uneasy without knowing why. There are gaps in the record of her childhood, and those gaps matter. No diaries survive, no personal letters, no recollections written later to soften memory. What remains are outlines, census entries, addresses, and fragments of testimony filtered through others. But absence tells its own story. Hannah did not grow up dreaming of rebellion. She grew up learning containment, learning how quickly the world closed ranks when a Black family stepped out of line, learning that safety was provisional, granted only as long as one remained useful, obedient, and unremarkable. By the early 1880s, Charles Elias's hard work paid off, at least outwardly. The family moved to a larger home in a neighborhood shared with lawyers and prominent Black businessmen. It was a step upward, a visible sign that discipline and patience could yield reward. Yet the rules did not change. Hannah, now a teenager, stood at the edge of adulthood in a society that offered her only narrow paths. Domestic work was respectable, marriage was expected, ambition beyond those boundaries was dangerous. And so, when an opportunity arose to work in the home of a wealthy white woman in northern Philadelphia, it was seen as a success, a good placement, proof that the Elias family was doing things correctly. Hannah entered that house not as a rebel, but as a servant, trained to be invisible, to move quietly through rooms she would never own, surrounded by objects she was meant to care for but never touch. It was there, in that house, that she first saw how thin the barrier was between admiration and accusation. And it was there, just before her sister Hattie's wedding in 1884, that Hannah made a choice so small it seemed harmless, and so unforgivable it would redirect her entire life. A dress, Elegant, expensive, beautiful, borrowed. She may have thought, returned. She may have planned, but in a world that had already decided how much grace a young black woman could be afforded, intention would not matter. That lesson was coming, and it would come quickly. The wedding was meant to be a celebration. In 1884, the Elias family gathered to mark the marriage of Hannah's sister. Hattie, a moment of pride, of progress, of proof that the family's careful climb had not been in vain. Relatives filled the room. Music spilled into the street. For a few hours, the weight of discipline and restraint loosened its grip. And then Hannah entered. She wore a dress unlike anything most of the guests had ever seen up close. The fabric caught the light. The tailoring spoke of money, of refinement, of access. Whispers moved through the room before she did. People stared, not with suspicion, but with admiration. Someone later said she was the belle of the evening. For Hannah. The moment was brief but intoxicating. Not because she sought attention, but because for once, she was not invisible. The dress did something the world rarely allowed her to do. It placed her at the center without apology. No one asked where it came from. No one questioned her right to wear it. Not that night. What Hannah intended after the wedding remains unknown. Perhaps she planned to return the dress quietly. Perhaps she believed no one would notice its absence. Perhaps, for once. She allowed herself to believe that admiration could exist without consequence. That belief lasted only days. Before she could return to work, police officers arrived at the Elias home. Their presence was abrupt, unquestioned, final. Hannah was taken into custody without ceremony, without negotiation. Her employer had noticed the missing dress. The conclusion had come swiftly. In an era when African Americans were rarely afforded the benefit of doubt, especially when accused by white employers, there was no pause for explanation, no inquiry into intent, no space for redemption. That same evening, Hannah stood before a court. The proceedings were brief, mechanical. The verdict inevitable, guilty. She was sentenced to 4 months in Moyamensing prison. 4 months. It was not a long sentence by legal standards, but it was long enough to leave a mark that would never fade. Moyamensing was a place built to erase softness. Hannah was confined in a women's section with roughly 40 others, surrounded by the distant noise of men imprisoned for violent crimes. The walls were cold, the routine unforgiving, privacy non-existent, for the first time. Hannah learned what it meant to be officially marked. Prison did not just punish the body, it rewrote identity. When she entered, she was a servant girl who had made a mistake. When she left, she was a woman with a record, a stain that would follow her wherever she went. She served the full sentence. There was no early release, no appeal, no sympathy extended for youth or circumstance. And something hardened. Not into rage, at least not outwardly, but into clarity. Hannah watched the women around her, listened, observed. She learned which rules mattered and which were illusions. She learned how punishment functioned not as correction, but as warning. Most of all, she learned this: the world was not interested in who she meant to be. It cared only about what it could make her. When Hannah was released, she did not return home as she had left it. Her father, Charles Elias, refused to let her live there. The decision was not framed as cruelty. It was framed as necessity. Respectability, once cracked, had to be preserved for the rest of the family. One daughter's mistake could not be allowed to endanger the futures of 8 others. So Hannah stood outside the door of the only life she had known, carrying the weight of her sentence alone. She was penniless. She was unwelcome. She was marked. Philadelphia had no place for her anymore, and so she did what many before her had done when a city closed its doors. She left, north, toward New York, a city vast enough to swallow history, cruel enough to demand reinvention, and indifferent enough to allow a woman like Hannah Elias to disappear into its streets. She did not leave seeking danger. She left seeking survival. But New York does not offer survival without a price, and Hannah was about to learn exactly what that price would be. When Hannah Elias stepped onto the street after her release from Moyamensing prison, Philadelphia no longer felt like home. The city looked the same. Brick row houses, narrow sidewalks, familiar corners, but something essential had shifted. She walked through neighborhoods she had known all her life, yet every step carried the awareness that she was now visible in the wrong way. Not as a daughter, not as a worker, but as a cautionary tale. Word traveled quickly. People knew where she had been. They did not ask questions. They did not ask what she had learned or what she needed. They simply adjusted their distance. Conversations quieted when she passed. Doors that once opened politely now remained closed. At her family's home, the decision had already been made. Charles Elias did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not shame her openly. That, somehow, made it worse. His refusal was delivered with the same discipline that had governed Hannah's childhood. The belief that order mattered more than sentiment. That one fracture could endanger the whole structure. She could not stay. Not now. Not here. The logic was brutal but familiar. Respectability was fragile. One daughter's conviction, however minor, was enough to undo years of careful progress. Employers talked, neighbors noticed, opportunities narrowed. Hannah was told she must find her own way. She left with little more than the clothes she wore and the understanding that return was not an option. No money, no protection, no reputation to fall back on. Philadelphia, the city that had raised her, had finished with her, for the first time. Hannah faced a reality she had never been taught to prepare for. Complete independence in a world designed to punish it. She moved north. New York City loomed in her imagination as both promise and threat. It was larger, louder, more anonymous. People disappeared there every day. For someone like Hannah, anonymity was not just attractive, it was necessary. The journey itself was unremarkable. No dramatic farewell, no tears recorded. Just a young woman crossing a boundary she could not uncross, leaving behind a version of herself she would never be allowed to reclaim. New York did not greet her kindly. She arrived with no connections, no stable work, and no safety net. The city's scale overwhelmed her. Streets stretched endlessly. Buildings blocked the sky. Crowds moved without curiosity or concern. In that indifference, Hannah found both danger and opportunity. She gravitated toward the Tenderloin district, an area known for its hotels, nightlife, and unspoken transactions. It was a place where rules bent easily and enforcement arrived selectively, a place where women survived by understanding exactly what was expected of them and what could be taken if they refused. Options narrowed quickly. Domestic service, once her path, was no longer available. References mattered. Records followed. Respectability was currency she no longer possessed. So Hannah made a choice. She became a prostitute, There was no romance in it, no illusion of control. It was survival in its rawest form, exchanging what the world demanded of her for food, shelter, and a measure of autonomy. The work was dangerous, unstable, and deeply stigmatized, but it required no approval from families or employers who had already written her off. Tenderloin taught her new lessons: how to read men quickly, how to measure risk, how to disappear when necessary. She learned when to speak and when silence was safer. She learned that vulnerability could be weaponized against her, or, if handled carefully, turned into leverage. But survival came with consequences. In 1885, Hannah became pregnant. The child, a daughter named Clara, was born at the start of 1886. The decision to give her up for adoption was swift and devastating. Hannah understood what the city would offer a child born under her circumstances, and she refused to subject Clara to that future. It was an act of mercy that felt like punishment. Not long after, Hannah was arrested again, this time for prostitution. She was sentenced to 1 month on Roosevelt Island, a reminder that New York's tolerance had limits and that women like her were always provisional citizens. When she was released, something had changed. Hannah did not return to the streets blindly. She adapted. She observed. She began to manage risk rather than merely endure it. She claimed she was Cuban, leveraging her lighter skin to move through certain spaces with less scrutiny. It was not truth. It was strategy. Slowly, deliberately, she stabilized. She earned enough to rent a place of her own, enough to step back from constant exposure, enough to imagine a future that did not rely entirely on the next night's transaction. Hannah Elias was no longer drifting. She was learning how to position herself, and she had no way of knowing that soon, very soon, one man would enter her life whose money would transform survival into security, and whose fear would one day shake New York itself. His name was John R. Platt. But before he became an accusation, before he became a scandal, he was simply a visitor, and Hannah was ready. By the late 1880s, Hannah Elias had learned something New York taught quickly and without mercy. Survival was not enough. The city was filled with people who survived. They lived from week to week, night to night, one misstep away from collapse. Hannah had already tasted that edge, and she had no intention of returning to it. What separated survival from security, she realized, was control. Not the loud kind, not the kind announced with threats or bravado, but the quiet kind, earned through patience, discretion, and an almost invisible discipline. After her release from Roosevelt Island, Hannah reshaped her life with deliberate care. She reduced her exposure, chose clients more selectively, avoided police attention. She studied the patterns of raids, the habits of patrolmen, the vulnerabilities of men who believe themselves untouchable. She also refined her presentation. Claiming to be Cuban was not an act of reinvention, it was camouflage. In a city flooded with immigrants from Europe and the Caribbean, ambiguity could be protection. Her lighter skin allowed questions to slide away rather than land. It did not erase prejudice, but it redirected it. Soon, Hannah was no longer just another woman in the Tenderloin. She was a presence. Men returned. They spoke of her as discreet, calm. Unlike others, she did not gossip. She did not cling. She did not threaten. She understood something essential about power. Those who possessed it feared exposure more than expense. And then, not long after she first arrived in New York, John R. Platt came to see her. Platt was already an established man by then, well into his 60s, wealthy from the plate glass business, Deeply embedded in New York's commercial elite, he was married, respected, protected by reputation. Their first meeting was unremarkable on the surface, a transaction like countless others unfolding across the city each night. But something in their dynamic shifted quickly. Platt returned, and then he returned again. By 1887, their encounters had grown regular. In a time before telephones were common and women in the Tenderloin moved often to avoid police scrutiny, they developed a system used by many discreet lovers, coded personal ads in the classified sections of New York newspapers. They called each other Bessie and Papa. Short, cryptic messages appeared, revealing where each would be staying, when, and how to make contact. To the untrained eye, they were meaningless. To those who knew how to read them, they were intimate maps. The affair was not brief. It stretched over years for Platt. Discretion was paramount. He valued Hannah's silence as much as her presence. She asked no questions, made no demands, left no traces. She understood the unspoken contract between them better than he did. And slowly, the nature of their relationship changed. Platt began giving her money. At first, it was casual. Gifts, allowances, gestures framed as generosity. Then it became structured. Monthly sums, regular support. The amounts were staggering by any standard, $2,000 to $6,000 per month, the modern equivalent of tens of thousands. This was not desperation. This was investment. Platt advised her, taught her how to buy property, how to evaluate neighborhoods, how to place money where it would grow quietly rather than attract attention. He encouraged her to think beyond immediate comfort. Hannah listened. She purchased houses, rented rooms, acquired assets north of Central Park, in areas that would later become Harlem, then still home to old New York families. Far from the Black cultural center it would one day be. She split her time between Manhattan and a lavish beach house in Far Rockaway, Queens. Her life took on a rhythm of order and distance. Servants replaced uncertainty. Deeds replaced fear. By the early 1900s, Hannah Elias lived in undeniable luxury. A maid, a butler, a full household staff. She no longer needed to be seen to be powerful, but power attracts attention, even when it hides. Whispers followed her wealth. Questions surfaced. How had she done it? Who was behind her? Why did a woman like her own so much in places like these? Platt, too, began to feel the strain. What once felt controlled began to feel exposed. The longer the money flowed, the more visible the absence became. From his accounts, from his family's future, from the legacy he believed he was building, fear crept in where confidence once lived. And fear, when left unexamined, curdles. It was during this period when wealth, secrecy, and resentment quietly coexisted that a single eviction would set in motion a chain of events neither Hannah nor Platt could have predicted. A tenant, a misunderstanding, a man named Cornelius Williams. The consequences of that moment would not arrive immediately. They would wait. And when they came, they would come with a gun. One of Hannah Elias's earliest investments was a narrow, respectable house not far from the home of John R. Platt himself. It was a calculated choice. The location promised steady tenants, quiet profit, and distance from the chaos of downtown Manhattan. Hannah did not live there permanently. She treated it as what it was meant to be, an asset, not a refuge. Among the tenants was a black man named Cornelius Williams. Williams was not wealthy, but he was proud. He paid his rent, kept to himself, and believed he understood the hierarchy of the house. Hannah, though his landlord, remained mostly invisible, an abstract authority rather than a daily presence. That illusion shattered one evening in 1895. John R. Platt arrived unannounced, using one of his aliases. "Mr. Green?" He knocked on the door. Williams answered, already irritated by the hour and the interruption, when the elderly white man asked if the folks were in. Williams took offense. He did not recognize the name. He did not like the tone. He did not like being questioned in his own building. He slammed the door in Platt's face. Later, Williams asked a servant who the visitor had been. The answer, "Mr. Green," meant nothing to him. But the encounter lodged itself in his mind, uncomfortable and unresolved. Weeks later, Hannah made a decision. Williams was asked to leave. The reasons were practical, not personal. His behavior had become erratic. He lingered. He watched. He asked questions. There was a sense, unspoken but unmistakable, that he had grown attached to the house, and perhaps to Hannah herself, in a way that crossed boundaries. Eviction was swift. For Williams, it was devastating. In his mind, the pieces aligned into a story he could not release. The mysterious white man, the timing, the sudden loss of his home. He became convinced that Mr. Green was responsible, that he had whispered something, influenced Hannah, pushed him out. Reality mattered less than certainty. Williams left the house furious and humiliated, carrying with him a grievance that did not fade with time. He talked about it, replayed it, nursed it. The city moved on. Hannah moved on. Platt likely forgot the man entirely, but Williams did not forget. Years passed. By 1903, Williams's resentment had fermented into obsession. His thoughts circled the same conclusions, hardened by isolation and paranoia. He watched houses, followed routines, built a private logic only he could understand. On a cold November afternoon, Andrew Haswell Green, the distinguished civic planner behind Central Park and the New York Public Library, was returning home after a family lunch. Green was elderly, dignified, and entirely unaware of the danger waiting for him. Williams stood nearby, revolver hidden, eyes fixed. In Green, he saw not the man before him, but the man he had been chasing in his mind for nearly a decade. Mr. Green. The name was enough. Williams fired. The bullet struck its target. Andrew Haswell Green collapsed on his own doorstep, dying without ever knowing why. A towering figure of New York's civic life fell victim to a vendetta that had nothing to do with him. The city was stunned. Williams was arrested quickly. The truth emerged in fragments: confusion, mistaken identity, delusion. At trial, he was declared insane and sent to an asylum, where he would spend the rest of his life. The story made headlines, but its deeper connections remained obscured. Hannah Elias's name appeared briefly, then faded from the narrative. Platt's involvement was never publicly emphasized. The tragedy was filed away as an act of madness, an isolated eruption of violence. But the chain was real: a house, a visitor, an eviction, a fixation, a death. Hannah Elias had not pulled the trigger. She had not intended harm, yet the life she had built, quiet, controlled, insulated, had brushed against a man already unraveling, and the consequences rippled outward beyond anyone's ability to contain them. By the time New York would later turn its full attention on Hannah in 1904, the city had already tasted what happened when private arrangements collided with public lives. Power left shadows, and sometimes those shadows killed the wrong man, unaware of how close catastrophe had already come. Hannah continued forward, marrying briefly, separating quietly, accumulating wealth steadily. But beneath the surface, tensions were tightening. John R. Platt was aging. His fortune was thinning. His fear was growing. And soon, The man who had helped Hannah build her security would attempt to destroy it by rewriting history and by calling the very generosity he once offered a crime. That reckoning was coming, and New York would watch it unfold. By the early 1890s, Hannah Elias had achieved something few women, let alone Black women, of her era ever managed: stability. Her life no longer depended on chance encounters or the volatility of the streets. She owned property. She collected rent. She moved through New York with the quiet confidence of someone who understood how the city worked and how to remain just outside its glare. And yet, respectability still mattered. No matter how much money she accumulated, Hannah knew that wealth alone did not grant legitimacy. A woman living alone, independent and discreetly affluent, invited questions. A married woman, even one whose marriage raised eyebrows, invited fewer. In 1890, Hannah married Christopher Smith, an African-American rail worker. On paper, it was an ordinary union. Smith held steady employment. He was respectable by the standards of the time, hardworking, grounded, and unremarkable. There was no public spectacle, no grand announcement. The marriage seemed to serve its purpose quietly, but it was never a partnership of equals. Hannah's world was expanding. Smith's was fixed. He moved along iron tracks that obeyed schedules and commands. She moved through rooms where discretion and influence mattered more than labor. Their lives intersected, but they did not align. And then there was John R. Platt. The relationship Hannah had built with Platt did not end with her marriage. It did not even pause. Platt's visits continued. The money continued. The guidance continued. Whatever Hannah and Smith shared, it was not intimacy in the fullest sense, and Smith eventually knew it. The arrangement grew intolerable. By 1897, Smith had reached his limit. He claimed that his wife's relationship with Platt was impossible to live alongside. Whether the confrontation was explosive or resigned is lost to history, but the outcome is clear. Smith left. Divorce followed soon after, in another household. Such a separation might have sparked scandal. In Hannah's case, it vanished quietly, smothered by money and discretion. Platt moved quickly to ensure that Smith caused no trouble. Legal complications were handled behind closed doors. Financial compensation smoothed what dignity could not. Silence was purchased. For Platt, this was still generosity. For Hannah, it was necessity. For Smith, it was the price of stepping away. By then, Platt's own wife had died. The final barrier, however symbolic, was gone. Soon after, Platt purchased Hannah an elegant townhouse near Central Park, placing her closer to his own residence and further from scrutiny. The move was strategic, convenience disguised as care, proximity framed as affection, but the dynamic between them had changed. What once felt like indulgence began to feel like obligation. Platt was older now. His wealth, though vast, was no longer inexhaustible. The sums he had given Hannah over the years had grown too large to ignore, even for a man accustomed to excess. Fear crept in, not fear of exposure. Hannah had given him no reason to doubt her discretion, but fear of reckoning, of accounts examined too closely, of heirs asking questions, of legacies reevaluated. The very silence he had once paid for now unnerved him. Hannah sensed the shift. She did not confront him. She did not demand reassurance. She had survived long enough to recognize when certainty was dissolving in another person. Instead, she reinforced what she controlled: her assets, her distance, her discipline. The relationship endured, but uneasily. By the turn of the century, Hannah Elias stood at the height of her independence. She lived surrounded by servants. She traveled between properties. She required nothing publicly from Platt, and that, paradoxically, made her more dangerous in his eyes, because a woman who needed nothing could not be easily managed. As years passed, Platt's unease hardened into something sharper. Guilt mingled with resentment. Generosity recast itself as victimhood. The story he told himself began to change. What if the money had not been freely given? What if discretion had not been mutual? What if silence had been enforced, not chosen? By the summer of 1904, Platt would act on that revised history. But before the accusation, before the courts, before Hannah Elias became a headline, there was a quieter collapse taking place, one that unfolded not in public records, but in the private fear of a man watching his fortune disappear into a woman he could no longer control. That fear would soon demand an audience, and New York would provide one. When John R. Platt finally went to the authorities in the summer of 1904, he did not do so as a desperate man. He did it as a calculating one. By then, he had rehearsed the story until it felt solid in his own mind. Years of generosity were reimagined as years of coercion. Payments once framed as gifts were now described as demands. Silence, once mutually agreed upon, became extortion. Platt presented himself not as a willing participant in a long affair, but as a victim trapped by his own shame, according to his account. Everything had begun innocently. He claimed that his first visit to Hannah Elias in the late 1880s had not been for pleasure at all. He had merely wandered into what he described as a massage parlor, seeking relief from rheumatism. Nothing improper, he insisted, nothing illicit. But somehow, that visit had become leverage. Platt alleged that Hannah had discovered his vulnerability and used it, over time. She had threatened to expose him, to his family, to society, unless he continued to pay. The amounts escalated. The years passed. The money flowed. By the time he spoke, he claimed, the damage was irreversible. The police listened. Platt was a respected figure. His wealth lent credibility to his words. His age lent him sympathy. His version of events aligned neatly with the racial and moral anxieties already simmering in the city. Hannah Elias was summoned. She refused to cooperate. This defiance was not dramatic. It was measured. When officers approached her for questioning, she declined politely and firmly. She had learned long ago that compliance did not guarantee protection, and that silence, when chosen carefully, could be its own defense. The response was swift. Police entered her townhouse and seized documents, letters, and personal belongings, anything that might support Platt's claim. Hannah was arrested and taken to the Tombs, the notorious prison in Lower Manhattan known for its filth, cold, and despair. The optics were damning. A wealthy black woman led away in custody, a white millionaire standing publicly as the injured party. Newspapers rushed to fill the gaps with speculation, embellishment, and outrage. For several days, Hannah remained behind bars. Those days mattered. They were meant to break her, to isolate her, to signal to the city that power still flowed in predictable directions. But something unexpected happened instead. The evidence failed to materialize. Investigators combed through the seized materials. They searched for threats, demands, proof of leverage. They found nothing that supported Platt's claims. No blackmail letters, no ultimatums, no signs of extortion. What they did find were financial records, clean, consistent, voluntary. Checks signed without protest. Transfers made regularly, investments encouraged, not resisted. The picture that emerged was not one of fear, but of intention. Platt had paid Hannah because he wanted to. After several tense days, Hannah was released. No charges, no apology. The case against her collapsed quietly, almost embarrassingly. The police concluded that there was no basis for criminal prosecution. Whatever the nature of Hannah and Platt's relationship, it did not meet the legal standard for blackmail. For Hannah, freedom came without celebration. She returned home without comment, resuming her life as if the interruption had been temporary, which, to her, it had been for Platt. The failure was humiliating, but the story did not end there. If criminal law could not retrieve the money, civil action might, and if Platt hesitated, his family did not. Once his relatives understood how much of the estate had been transferred to Hannah Elias over the years, panic set in. What they had assumed was a secure inheritance had evaporated into real property, trusts, and accounts bearing her name. They wanted it back. When Platt withdrew his criminal complaint, his family stepped forward, filing civil suits in an attempt to reclaim the fortune. The argument was familiar: manipulation, undue influence, moral wrongdoing. Again. The courts examined the evidence. Again. The case fell apart. There was no proof that Hannah had forced anything. The money had been given freely, repeatedly, over decades. Regret, the court found, was not a crime. By early 1905, the scandal began to lose momentum. Newspapers moved on. Public attention drifted. Hannah Elias was formally exonerated, not declared virtuous, but declared untouchable by law. The episode exposed something uncomfortable about New York at the turn of the century. The outrage had never been proportional to the evidence. It had been proportional to the fear. Fear of a woman who refused to explain herself. Fear of a black woman who possessed wealth without apology. Fear of what it meant when power could no longer pretend to be one-sided. The case faded, but the damage lingered. Hannah Elias would never again enjoy anonymity in New York. The city had memorized her name, even if it no longer spoke it aloud, and she was already preparing to leave, because she understood something most of her critics never did. Victory in court did not mean safety in society, and the price of being proven right was often the loss of everything familiar. Her final chapter in New York was already being written. It would not be loud. It would be deliberate. And when she vanished, the city would be left with nothing but speculation and the uncomfortable truth it had tried and failed to bury. Exoneration did not bring peace. When the courts found no evidence of blackmail and the civil suits collapsed under their own weight, New York did not apologize to Hannah Elias. The city simply grew quieter about her, as if silence could undo the attention it had already lavished on her life. But the damage was permanent. Newspapers that had once printed her name in bold letters now let it slip into smaller columns, then into absence. Yet the tone of coverage lingered in the public imagination. Hannah was no longer a criminal in the eyes of the law, but she remained a problem in the eyes of society. The scandal had exposed too much. It had revealed that a respected white businessman could spend decades funding the rise of a black woman, and that the legal system, when forced to confront clear evidence, would not always bend to racial expectation. That contradiction unsettled people far more than guilt ever could. In the months after the case fizzled out, a quieter narrative took hold. Some papers leaned into insinuation rather than accusation. They speculated about Hannah's origins, reviving rumors that she was foreign-born, Cuban, Caribbean, anything but American. In a city grappling with waves of European immigration, the idea of an outsider manipulating wealth and power proved irresistible. It shifted the fear. If Hannah Elias was not one of them, then the system had not truly failed. It had merely been infiltrated. The truth, that she had been born in Philadelphia, raised within the narrow confines allowed to Black families, and shaped by American institutions at every turn, was far less convenient. Hannah watched all of this from a distance she had carefully cultivated. She continued to collect rent, continued to manage her properties, continued to live well. But she also understood that the city had changed its relationship with her. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer merely discreet. She was known, and being known carried risk. John R. Platt died in 1908, leaving behind an estate valued at roughly $10,000, a surprisingly modest sum compared to the fortune he had once commanded. None of it was left to Hannah. She did not attend his funeral. There was no public reckoning, no final confrontation. Their relationship ended not with closure, but with erasure, as Harlem began its transformation in the 1910s, emerging as a center of Black life and culture. Hannah remained on the margins. She participated in land transactions, bought and sold strategically, but she did not embed herself in the social currents that would soon define the neighborhood. Fame had taught her caution. Anonymity, once lost, was not easily regained in a city that thrived on memory and myth. Lawsuits, some real, some threatened, hovered at the edges of her financial past. Old resentments lingered. New risks emerged. By 1923, Hannah made a decision that surprised few who truly understood her. She left. Her Japanese butler, Kato, accompanied her to Europe. They boarded a ship quietly, without announcement or farewell. New York did not mark her departure. There were no headlines, no retrospectives. The city simply absorbed her absence. Hannah settled in France. What happened next dissolves into legend. Some accounts claim she died in Paris, living comfortably but privately. Others insist she spent her final years in luxury on the French Riviera, far from the city that once tried to define her. No grave has been definitively identified. No final records close the story cleanly. Perhaps that was intentional. Hannah Elias had spent her life navigating systems that demanded visibility in order to punish and invisibility in order to survive. In the end, she chose neither. She chose distance. Her legacy remains unsettled, not because facts are missing, but because meaning is. Was she a survivor? A strategist? A symbol of forbidden power? A mirror held up to a city that refused to look at itself honestly? New York never agreed on the answer. What remains undeniable is this: Hannah Elias did not take what was given to her world. She learned how to receive it, how to keep it, and when the cost of staying became too high, how to leave it behind. The city moved on, but the discomfort she left in her wake never fully did. Long before New York would hear his name spoken in courtrooms and headlines, John R. Platt was already a fixture of the city's quiet power. Born in 1820, Platt belonged to a generation that had built its wealth before spectacle became fashionable. His fortune came from plate glass, a business as unglamorous as it was essential. Windows for storefronts, panels for offices, glass that allowed commerce to display itself. Platt understood something fundamental. Visibility was profitable, as long as the mechanisms behind it remained unseen. By the time he met Hannah Elias, Platt was a widower in all but name, a married man living a carefully partitioned life. His public identity was immaculate. His private needs were buried beneath routine, age, and the unspoken permissions afforded to men like him. He did not see himself as reckless. He saw himself as entitled. When Platt first encountered Hannah in the late 1880s, he did not believe he was entering into danger. To him, she was discreet, composed, and refreshingly unlike the chaos he associated with the Tenderloin district. She did not dramatize her circumstances. She did not flatter excessively. She listened. That alone distinguished her. Their early encounters carried the tone of mutual convenience. Platt provided money. Hannah provided silence. Desire was present, but it was not the axis around which the relationship turned. What mattered more was control. Specifically, Platt's belief that he retained it for years. That belief went unchallenged. Platt enjoyed the illusion that he was shaping Hannah's life. Advising her on property purchases reinforced that fantasy. Each investment felt like proof of his benevolence, his wisdom, his influence. He told himself that without him, she would not have risen, that her success was, in some fundamental way, an extension of his own. This narrative mattered to him. It allowed Platt to reconcile contradiction, to justify excess, to see generosity where others might see dependency, and as long as Hannah remained discreet, distant, and self-contained, the story held. But time erodes illusion. As Hannah's portfolio expanded, something subtle shifted. She no longer needed instruction. She no longer relied on his approval. She did not seek reassurance. She operated independently, efficiently, and without visible gratitude. To Platt, this felt like loss. The money kept flowing, but the balance of power he believed existed began to dissolve. Hannah was no longer a project. She was no longer an extension. She was an entity, and entities could not be controlled the way individuals could. Platt aged into this realization reluctantly. His wealth, once vast enough to obscure consequence, began to feel finite. The sums he had transferred, once abstract, now loomed large when measured against inheritance, legacy, and reputation. He began to worry not about what he had done, but about how it might be framed. Memory, he discovered, was malleable. What had once felt voluntary could be reinterpreted as obligation. What had once felt mutual could be recast as coercive. And if enough people believed that version, perhaps he could believe it too. By the early 1900s, Platt's private anxiety hardened into something sharper. Fear. Fear of scrutiny. Fear of exposure. Fear of dying with a story he no longer controlled. The very discretion he had prized in Hannah now worked against him. There were no letters to prove affection, no witnesses to testify to generosity. Only transactions, vast, undeniable, and difficult to explain. And so Platt began to rewrite the past. Not publicly at first. Internally, he told himself that Hannah must have understood what she was doing, that she had benefited unfairly, that she had, in some way, compelled him, if not through explicit threat, then through implication. This reframing gave him relief. It transformed shame into grievance. By the time Platt approached his family, the story had crystallized. He was no longer the architect of Hannah's fortune. He was its victim, and victims, he believed, were entitled to redress. The law, he assumed, would understand. What Platt failed to account for was that courts did not evaluate emotion. They evaluated evidence. And evidence had a way of resisting narrative, especially when that narrative depended on forgetting years of deliberate choice. As the summer of 1904 approached, Platt stood at a crossroads of his own making. He could remain silent and accept the consequences of his decisions, or he could speak and risk unleashing a scandal that would no longer belong to him alone. He chose the second path, and in doing so, he underestimated the one person who had never relied on illusion to survive. Hannah Elias. Once John R. Platt convinced himself that he had been wronged, everything else followed with grim logic. What he needed was not truth, but validation. He began speaking carefully to those closest to him, family members, advisors, men who shared his assumptions about how the world was supposed to work. He did not describe passion. He did not describe choice. He described entrapment, a slow, humiliating drain, a situation that had grown beyond his control. And they listened. To Platt's family, the numbers were what mattered most. When they saw the figures laid out, property after property, transfer after transfer, the scale of the loss eclipsed any concern for nuance. Whatever Hannah Elias had been to Platt, she was now a threat to their future. They urged action. Platt hesitated at first, not out of loyalty to Hannah, but out of fear. He understood the danger of exposure, the public humiliation, the questions that would inevitably turn back on him. But fear cuts both ways. What terrified him more than scandal was the idea that his fortune, his life's work, had slipped beyond the reach of his bloodline, that his legacy would be defined not by industry, but by indulgence in that framing. Hannah Elias became more than a woman. She became a mistake that needed correcting. Platt's decision to involve the law was not impulsive. It was strategic. He chose language carefully. He emphasized age, vulnerability, and shame. He framed the relationship as something that had begun innocently and curdled into menace. Blackmail was the word that carried the most power. It suggested coercion without requiring proof of violence. It allowed Platt to retain dignity while shifting blame. It invited the public to sympathize without asking difficult questions about desire or consent. When he finally went to the authorities, Platt expected cooperation, and initially, he received it. Police treated his complaint seriously, not because it was airtight, but because of who he was. A man of his standing did not, in their view, invent stories without cause. Hannah Elias, by contrast, was an unknown quantity, wealthy. Yes, but socially isolated, racially marginalized, and inconveniently silent. The imbalance was obvious. Yet as the investigation progressed, enthusiasm gave way to discomfort. Every attempt to substantiate Platt's claims ran into the same obstacle: documentation. There were no threatening letters, no recorded demands, no witnesses to intimidation. Instead, there were years of regular payments, many initiated by Platt himself. There were financial advisors who confirmed that he had encouraged Hannah's investments. There were property deeds that showed careful planning, not hurried concealment. The facts refused to bend. What Platt had assumed would be a simple correction of record became a slow unraveling of his narrative. Each document contradicted the idea of helplessness. Each transaction suggested intention. The case began to feel less like a crime and more like regret. That distinction mattered enormously, because regret could not be prosecuted. As doubts mounted, Platt's confidence eroded. The very process he had initiated now exposed him to scrutiny he had hoped to avoid. His private life was being reconstructed not by rumor, but by numbers. Cold, precise, and unforgiving. And still, Hannah Elias did not speak. Her refusal to participate frustrated everyone involved. Police wanted a confession or a contradiction. Reporters wanted spectacle. Platt wanted absolution. What they received instead was silence backed by paperwork. It became increasingly clear that if this dispute continued, it would not end with Hannah's ruin, but with Platt's embarrassment. The story he had tried to control was slipping beyond his grasp, reshaped by evidence rather than accusation. Behind closed doors, advisors urged retreat. The criminal case, they warned, was weak, dangerous. Even, the longer it continued, the more it exposed Platt's agency in the very acts he now condemned. Reluctantly, he withdrew, but withdrawal did not bring relief. To Platt's family, retreat felt like surrender. They were unwilling to accept that so much wealth had passed beyond their reach without recourse. If criminal law could not help them, civil law would have to. The conflict shifted arenas, but not intensity. What had begun as a claim of blackmail became a battle over narrative, over whether a woman like Hannah Elias could be allowed to keep what she had been given. And beneath that question lay another, more dangerous one. If Hannah Elias had not stolen her fortune, what did that say about the men who helped her build it? By the time the civil suits were filed, the city was already growing restless. The story no longer offered easy villains or comforting conclusions. It forced readers to confront the possibility that power, when exercised privately, did not always leave visible scars. And that frightened them. For John R. Platt, the fight had already cost more than money. It had cost him certainty. The story he told himself no longer held. He was no longer sure whether he was the victim or merely a man unwilling to accept responsibility for his own choices. That reckoning would not bring him peace, but it would define how history remembered him. And it would cement Hannah Elias not as a footnote in his life, but as a figure New York would never quite know how to judge. When the civil suits finally collapsed, there was no victory celebration, only exhaustion. The courts had spoken clearly enough. The money John R. Platt had given to Hannah Elias was not the product of coercion. It was not the result of fraud. It was not stolen, extorted, or illegally obtained. It was given, freely, repeatedly, and with intent, legally. The matter was finished. Socially, it never would be. Platt retreated from public view, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. The authority he once carried effortlessly now felt brittle. His name still commanded respect, but it no longer inspired certainty. Those who knew the details understood what the verdict implied, even if they never said it aloud. He had not been overpowered. He had chosen, and choice, once acknowledged, carried consequences no lawsuit could undo. Hannah Elias, meanwhile, did what she had always done best. She endured quietly. There was no press conference, no memoir, no attempt to reshape her image or claim moral high ground. She did not seek sympathy, nor did she attempt to re-enter society on its terms. She continued managing her affairs with the same discipline that had carried her this far. But the atmosphere around her had changed. She could feel it in the way business associates hesitated before shaking her hand, in the way neighbors watched her a second longer than before, in the subtle recalibration of distance that followed public scandal. Even when the scandal had failed, New York had not forgiven her, not because she had been found guilty, but because she had not been punished. The city preferred stories where power resolved itself cleanly, where lines were clear, where consequences aligned neatly with expectation. Hannah Elias disrupted that comfort. She remained wealthy, autonomous, unrepentant, and she remained silent. That silence became its own kind of provocation. People speculated endlessly about what Hannah must know, what she must have seen, what secrets she carried to the grave. The fact that she never weaponized that knowledge, never exposed Platt, never humiliated his family, only deepened the unease. Why protect a man who tried to destroy her? The answer was simpler than anyone wanted to accept. Hannah had never needed revenge. She had already won. John R. Platt died in 1908, 4 years after the scandal first broke. His estate was a shadow of what it once had been. The money that had flowed so freely into Hannah's hands was gone for good, converted into property and investments beyond reclamation. His family mourned privately. There was no public reckoning, no admission of error. History moved on, as it often does, leaving unresolved discomfort in its wake. Hannah did not attend the funeral. Her absence was noticed. By the 1910s, Harlem began to transform. Black professionals, artists, and entrepreneurs moved north of Central Park, reshaping the neighborhood into a cultural and economic center that would soon ignite the Harlem Renaissance. Hannah participated in this shift cautiously, buying, selling, leasing, but she never embraced visibility. She had learned what attention cost. Instead, she positioned herself on the margins of the moment, close enough to benefit, distant enough to remain protected. Her wealth continued to grow. Her name, however, remained suspended, half forgotten, half mythologized. Rumors followed her like shadows. Some claimed she was still being pursued legally. Others insisted she had connections no one dared investigate. The truth was more mundane and more dangerous. She had outlived the scandal without submitting to it. By 1923, Hannah understood that New York would never fully release her. The city remembered too much and understood too little. Every new venture invited old questions. Every interaction carried the weight of a story people thought they already knew. So she made a final calculation. She sold what needed selling, consolidated what could be consolidated, and then, quietly, she arranged her departure. Her Japanese butler, Kato, accompanied her. Together, they boarded a ship bound for Europe. There were no announcements, no farewells, no dramatic exit. Hannah Elias simply left. France offered distance, geographical, cultural, psychological, in Paris. She could exist without explanation, in the South, along the Riviera. She could live comfortably without being examined as a symbol. What happened next slips beyond certainty. Some say she died quietly in Paris. Others insist she lived out her days in luxury by the sea. Records thin, stories diverge. Hannah Elias, once dragged into public obsession, reclaimed privacy as her final act. Perhaps that was the point. She had spent her life navigating systems designed to strip women like her of control. In the end, she denied history the satisfaction of a neat conclusion. No confession, no punishment, no redemption arc tailored for comfort. Only a life lived on her own terms, and an exit that refused to explain itself. New York never fully decided what Hannah Elias represented. A criminal who got away with it, a survivor who outsmarted the system, a mirror held up to power's hypocrisy. What remains undeniable is this. Hannah Elias did not ask to be remembered, but the city has never quite managed to forget her. If the courts had closed the case against Hannah Elias, the city had not. New York in the early 20th century was not merely a place, it was a machine. It absorbed people, sorted them, assigned meaning, and discarded what did not fit cleanly into its categories. Hannah's story jammed that machine, and when systems fail, they often respond not with correction, but with distortion. The legal outcome had been clear. No blackmail, no crime, no restitution. Yet the newspapers could not let go. Coverage shifted tone, not direction. Where accusations had failed, implication took over. Journalists revisited Hannah's background with renewed intensity, searching for explanations that would satisfy public discomfort. If she could not be condemned for what she had done, she would be questioned for who she was. Race moved from subtext to centerpiece. Articles speculated openly about her ancestry, her true origins, her supposed foreignness. Some claimed she was Cuban, others hinted at Caribbean roots. The implication was unmistakable. She could not be fully American. Because America, so the logic went, did not produce women like Hannah Elias. This reframing served a purpose. At the turn of the century, New York was straining under the weight of immigration. Millions of Europeans were arriving, reshaping neighborhoods, economies, and identities. Anxiety simmered just beneath the surface. The idea of a mysterious foreign woman infiltrating elite society tapped directly into that fear. It allowed the city to externalize its unease. If Hannah was an outsider, then the system itself remained intact. It had not failed. It had been deceived. The reality was far more unsettling. Hannah Elias was not foreign. She was a product of American institutions, its labor markets, its justice system, its racial hierarchies. She had learned its rules early and adapted to them ruthlessly. The scandal of 1904 did not reveal a loophole exploited by an outsider. It revealed the system working exactly as designed. That truth was harder to swallow. Public reaction fractured along familiar lines. Some admired Hannah quietly, seeing in her a rare example of agency in a world stacked against her. Others resented her openly, disturbed by the idea that a black woman could accumulate wealth without punishment or permission, and many, perhaps most, felt something more ambiguous: unease. Because Hannah's existence raised questions no one wanted to answer honestly. How many other fortunes had been built quietly, immorally, but legally? How many powerful men relied on discretion purchased rather than integrity practiced? How often did society reward behavior it publicly condemned? Hannah Elias did not fit the moral narratives people depended on. She was not repentant. She was not ruined. She was not grateful. She did not seek absolution, nor did she offer condemnation. She simply continued living, wealthy, autonomous, uninterested in public approval. That refusal to perform became its own offense. In private clubs and dining rooms, conversations circled the same uncomfortable points. Some blamed Platt for his weakness. Others blamed Hannah for her ambition. Few blamed the structure that made such arrangements inevitable and profitable. For women like Hannah, power was never inherited. It was navigated, extracted, defended, and New York did not know what to do with that. As years passed, the city's fascination cooled, but its memory did not. Hannah's name lingered as shorthand for scandal, whispered more than spoken. She became a reference point, a warning, a curiosity, a footnote invoked when conversations drifted toward race, money, and desire. She had become symbolic without consenting to symbolism, and symbols, once created, are rarely allowed to rest. Hannah understood this better than anyone. She had lived long enough to see how narratives were built, dismantled, and repurposed. She had survived not by correcting those narratives, but by stepping outside them, which is why, even as Harlem began to rise and Black prosperity found new visibility, Hannah remained deliberately distant. She had no interest in becoming an icon. Visibility had already cost her enough. Instead, she focused on consolidation, of assets, of distance, of silence. She prepared for a future not tied to New York's approval or curiosity, a future that did not require explanation. The city that had tried to define her would soon discover that she had no intention of remaining available for interpretation, because Hannah Elias had learned the most important lesson New York ever taught her. Power is not proven by staying, sometimes. It is proven by leaving. By the early 1910s, New York had entered a new phase of itself. Skyscrapers pushed higher. Money moved faster. Harlem began its transformation into a center of Black life, ambition, and cultural gravity. New faces arrived with hope rather than caution. The city spoke of progress loudly, almost defensively, for Hannah Elias. Progress felt like exposure. She watched the changes from a careful distance. On paper, this should have been her moment. She owned property in Harlem before it became desirable. She had capital when others were just beginning to dream. She had survived forces that crushed less prepared people. Yet she did not step forward. The reason was simple. Hannah understood how quickly admiration turned into appetite. The scandal of 1904 had taught her that visibility did not protect wealth. It invited interrogation. Every success raised questions. Every question carried risk. Even when law stood on her side, society rarely did. And New York society, once curious, never truly stopped watching. Though the newspapers no longer printed her name regularly, it surfaced in conversation. Lawyers remembered it. Bankers remembered it. Investors remembered it. Hannah Elias had become a reference point, a reminder of what could happen when private arrangements slipped into public view. She felt the shift most sharply in business, where negotiations had once been straightforward. They now came with hesitation. Partners asked unnecessary questions. Clerks took extra time verifying documents. Associates lowered their voices when discussing her holdings, as if discretion itself had become suspect. Nothing overt, nothing illegal, just pressure. This was the cost of notoriety. Not punishment, but friction. Not exclusion, but erosion. Hannah adjusted accordingly. She streamlined her portfolio, reduced exposure, sold properties that required too much interaction, retained those that produced income quietly, without drawing attention. She moved her residence uptown, where anonymity was easier to maintain and neighbors minded their own affairs. She stopped hosting, stopped entertaining, stopped explaining. Life narrowed into efficiency. Those who encountered her described a woman reserved to the point of opacity, polite but distant, generous to servants, but firm. She did not complain about her past. She did not revisit the scandal. She behaved as though it were an administrative inconvenience, nothing more. That refusal to dwell unsettled people. Society preferred visible remorse or visible triumph. Hannah offered neither. She existed in between, immune to moral categorization. Meanwhile, whispers about unresolved lawsuits and financial improprieties followed her like fog. Some were exaggerations. Others were misunderstandings. A few may have contained fragments of truth lost to time. What mattered was not accuracy, but persistence. Hannah recognized the pattern. The city did not need her to be guilty. It only needed her to remain questionable. That realization sharpened her thinking. She had built her life by understanding systems, how they rewarded obedience, how they punished deviation, how they pretended neutrality while enforcing hierarchy. Now, she saw the final phase clearly. New York would never fully let her go, even if she stayed silent, even if she complied, even if she vanished socially. The story would linger, waiting to be revived whenever convenient. So she began planning an exit, not impulsively, not dramatically. Hannah Elias did nothing impulsively. She studied options, consulted discreetly, and assessed distance the way she once assessed risk. Europe offered something New York could not. Space. In Paris. She would not be a symbol. On the French Riviera. She would not be a scandal. She would be an American woman of means. Nothing more. Nothing less. By 1923, the decision had matured into certainty. She sold selectively, transferred assets, reduced entanglements. The process was invisible to anyone not looking closely, which was exactly the point. Only one person accompanied her preparations closely. Her butler, Kato. Kato, a Japanese man, had served Hannah with loyalty and discretion for years. He asked few questions and received few answers. He understood that his employer valued silence not as secrecy, but as discipline. When Hannah informed him of the move, he did not hesitate. They booked passage quietly. No announcements were made. No social obligations concluded. Hannah Elias had learned long ago that exits were safest when they went unnoticed. And yet, As the departure date approached, something lingered. New York had shaped her profoundly through cruelty, opportunity, and contradiction. It had taught her how to see power clearly. Stripped of romance, it had forced her to become precise, patient, and unsentimental. Leaving did not feel like triumph. It felt like closure. On the day she departed, the city continued as it always did. Ferries crossed the harbor. Carriages moved through streets now crowded with automobiles. People hurried past one another, unaware that a woman who had once unsettled their assumptions was slipping away. Hannah Elias did not look back. She had already given New York everything it was ever entitled to. What lay ahead was not redemption or escape. It was something rarer, freedom without witnesses. When Hannah Elias boarded the ship bound for Europe, there was no sense of drama attached to the moment. No crowd gathered to watch her go. No reporter scribbled her name. No farewell marked the end of an era. That was intentional. She had learned that spectacle was never neutral. It devoured context, twisted intention, and left only caricature behind. If she was to leave New York for the last time, she would do so the way she had lived most of her adult life, quietly, deliberately, without permission. The harbor was gray that morning. Steam hissed. Dock workers shouted instructions that dissolved into the wind. Hannah stood apart from the noise, her posture composed, her movements economical. Beside her, Cato handled the arrangements with practiced efficiency. To anyone watching, she was simply another American woman of means traveling abroad. No one saw the history folded into her luggage. No one guessed what she represented to the city she was leaving behind. As the ship pulled away, Manhattan receded into abstraction, buildings blending into a single jagged line against the sky. Hannah did not linger at the railing. She did not indulge nostalgia. The city had already taught her what memory cost. What mattered was distance. Europe offered anonymity not because it was kinder, but because it was unfamiliar. In Paris, Hannah was not a headline. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a challenge to anyone's assumptions about race, gender, or power. She was simply a foreigner with money. That distinction mattered. Accounts of her life after leaving New York are fragmented, inconsistent, and colored by speculation. Some place her in Paris, living comfortably but privately, frequenting cafes without becoming a fixture. Others insist she settled along the French Riviera, enjoying sunlight, discretion, and the ease that wealth could buy far from American scrutiny. What is certain is what did not happen. She did not return. She did not publish a defense. She did not attempt to reclaim narrative control. Hannah Elias allowed the story to fade rather than compete with it. In doing so, she denied history the clarity it craved for New York. Her absence created a vacuum. Over time, her name became less specific, more symbolic. Writers reduced her to shorthand. Moralists simplified her into warning. Others romanticized her as a triumph over injustice. All of them missed something essential. Hannah Elias was never interested in representing anyone. She was interested in surviving systems designed to erase her, navigating power without being consumed by it, and exiting before the cost outweighed the benefit. That, perhaps, is why her ending resists documentation. There is no confirmed date of death, no universally accepted location, no grave that anchors her story to a single place. She dissolved into history the way she had once dissolved into New York, by refusing to explain herself. And that refusal remains unsettling, because it forces a reckoning not with who Hannah Elias was, but with what she revealed. She exposed how easily wealth could cross moral boundaries without legal consequence. She exposed how discretion functioned as currency among the powerful. She exposed how society punished women not for transgression, but for autonomy, most uncomfortably. She exposed how race shaped outrage more than evidence ever did. In the end, Hannah Elias did not conquer New York. She outlasted it. The city continued to grow. Harlem flourished. Skyscrapers replaced row houses. Generations passed. But the discomfort she introduced never fully disappeared. Her story resurfaced whenever questions arose about power exercised in private, about women who refused to perform remorse, about wealth that did not come with an approved origin story. Hannah Elias remains unresolved because she chose to be. She left behind no confession, no apology, no lesson neatly packaged for consumption. What she left behind instead was a challenge, a reminder that not every life exists to be understood on public terms. Some lives are simply lived, and some exits are the final assertion of control. For Hannah Elias, leaving was not escape. It was authorship. For most of New York, the murder of Andrew Haswell Green in November 1903 was a tragedy with a simple explanation. An elderly civic hero, returning home after a family lunch, shot dead on his own doorstep. The city mourned him as one of its great architects, the quiet mind behind Central Park, the New York Public Library, the ordered beauty of public space. His death was framed as senseless, abrupt, and deeply unfair. The official conclusion followed quickly. The killer, Cornelius Williams, was declared insane, a disturbed man, a lone actor, a mind untethered from reason. He was sent to an asylum, and with that, the case was considered closed. But closure was an illusion, because beneath the official narrative ran a thinner, darker thread, one the city never fully pulled. Perhaps because it did not like where it led. Williams had not targeted Andrew Haswell Green. He had targeted Mr. Green, a name that meant nothing to the public and everything to him, years earlier. That name had belonged to a white visitor at one of Hannah Elias's properties, John R. Platt, using an alias. A brief, forgettable encounter for Platt. A door slammed. A moment passed. For Williams, it became an anchor, evicted from Hannah's house soon after. Humiliated and disoriented, he built a private mythology in which his misfortune had a face and a name. Time did not erode that belief. It hardened it. 8 years passed, and the obsession remained intact. When he saw Andrew Haswell Green, an elderly white man, well-dressed, approaching his home, Williams did not see a stranger. He saw resolution. The bullet that killed Green was not fired in rage so much as in certainty. In Williams's fractured mind, the story had finally reached its end. The city recoiled at the randomness of it all. A man of immense civic importance killed because of a name he happened to share. A life ended not by personal conflict, but by coincidence layered upon obsession. What New York did not fully confront was the proximity of the tragedy to its own structures of power. This was not a crime born in isolation. It was born in housing arrangements, in quiet visits, in evictions that carried more weight than they appeared to. It was born in a world where people moved through one another's lives without seeing the consequences ripple outward. Hannah Elias's role in this story was minimal and unavoidable. She had not known William's internal world. She had not anticipated violence. She had acted as landlords did every day, deciding who stayed and who left. Yet the life she had built intersected with a man already unraveling, and the result was irreversible. The city did not linger on that connection. To do so would have complicated the narrative. It would have forced questions about how private power arrangements created public risk, about how invisibility and proximity coexisted in dangerous ways. Instead, the story was simplified. Williams was insane. Green was unlucky. The system was blameless. But systems rarely are. The murder lingered in the background of the 1904 scandal like a suppressed memory. When Hannah Elias's name later surfaced in courtrooms and headlines, some reporters briefly revisited the Green case, sensing a connection without fully articulating it. They never pursued it far, perhaps because doing so would have revealed how easily respectable lives brushed against instability, and how thin the line was between order and chaos in a city built on quiet transactions. For Hannah, the death was another reminder of something she already understood. Control was never absolute. No matter how carefully she managed her affairs, no matter how disciplined her choices, the world contained variables that could not be predicted or contained. The best one could do was limit exposure and leave when exposure grew dangerous. New York, meanwhile, absorbed the shock and moved on. It always did. But beneath its relentless forward motion, the city carried unresolved echoes. Andrew Haswell Green became a martyr to randomness. Cornelius Williams became a cautionary tale of madness. And Hannah Elias remained what she had always been to New York, an uncomfortable intersection point, where private desire, public consequence, and social denial collided. The shooting was not her story, but it was part of the world that shaped it, and it foreshadowed a truth New York would encounter again and again. When power operates quietly and accountability arrives selectively, the cost is rarely paid by those who can afford it. It is paid by those standing in the wrong place, at the wrong door, under the wrong name. The declaration of insanity ended Cornelius Williams's story in the eyes of the law. Once doctors testified that his mind was unsound, the city exhaled. Madness was a convenient explanation. It sealed the case neatly, requiring no broader reckoning. Williams was removed from society and placed in an asylum, where he would spend the remainder of his life, out of sight, out of mind. The public accepted this readily. Insanity transformed a disturbing murder into an anomaly. It reassured New York that nothing systemic had failed, that no social conditions needed examination, that no one else bore responsibility. A madman had acted alone, and yet, the more one examined the facts, the less satisfying that conclusion became. Williams had not acted randomly. His fixation had a logic, distorted, yes, but persistent. It had survived years of time, poverty, displacement, and humiliation. He remembered a name. He remembered a face. He remembered a moment when his life tipped from fragile stability into chaos. That memory did not arise in a vacuum. Williams had lived in one of Hannah Elias's properties at a time when her life intersected with men who moved through the city under assumed names, protected by money and discretion. He had witnessed power pass through his living space without explanation. Then, he had been expelled from that space without recourse, for a man already unstable. Those events did not fade, they fused. New York preferred not to examine that chain of causality. To do so would have raised uncomfortable questions about housing insecurity, about the psychological costs of marginalization, about how proximity to power without access to it could fracture a person's sense of reality. It would have complicated the city's self-image as rational, ordered, and fundamentally fair. So the story was simplified. Williams was mad. Green was unlucky. End of discussion. But simplification does not erase consequence. The death of Andrew Haswell Green reverberated through the city's elite. He was mourned not just as a man, but as an idea, a symbol of civic order, planning, and enlightened progress. His murder felt like an attack on the city's narrative about itself. In that context, the notion that his death might be linked, however indirectly, to private arrangements involving a Black woman of wealth was intolerable. The connection was never formally denied. It was simply ignored. Hannah Elias, for her part, never commented on the case. She was not questioned publicly. She was not called to testify. Her name appeared briefly in some coverage, then disappeared again, folded back into the margins. That invisibility was not accidental. Authorities had no interest in reopening doors that led nowhere legally and everywhere socially. The murder had been resolved. Revisiting it would only reopen uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. For Hannah, the lesson was clear. No matter how carefully she conducted her life, she existed within systems that could transform proximity into liability. She could be implicated not by action, but by association, by coincidence, by being near events that spiraled beyond intention. The Green murder became another quiet marker, another reminder that control was partial and temporary. It reinforced her instinct toward distance, toward silence, toward exit. As the years passed, the case faded from public memory, surviving only in footnotes and specialist histories. Williams remained institutionalized. His obsession finally rendered harmless by confinement. Green's name lived on in parks and libraries, his death absorbed into the city's mythology, but the conditions that produced the tragedy did not disappear. They were simply redistributed. New York continued to thrive on private arrangements that never quite surfaced publicly, on relationships defined by imbalance and discretion, on assumptions about who bore responsibility when things went wrong. Hannah Elias moved through this landscape with increasing caution. She had already paid the price of visibility once. She had no desire to become entangled again, especially in stories that were never fully told, only selectively remembered. The city, meanwhile, carried on. It always did. But beneath its confident stride lay a pattern that repeated itself relentlessly. When events threatened to expose uncomfortable intersections of power, race, and accountability, they were reframed, softened, or forgotten. Madness was easier to accept than meaning, and coincidence was easier to process than consequence. Hannah Elias did not need to articulate this truth. She lived it, and as New York pushed forward into a new century, eager to see itself as modern, rational, and enlightened, she quietly prepared for the moment when living inside its stories would no longer be worth the cost. That moment was approaching, and when it came, she would leave behind not a confession or a legacy, but a question the city would never quite answer. What does it mean when the most unsettling figure in a scandal is not the one who breaks the law, but the one who exposes how comfortably others live beyond it? With Cornelius Williams confined to an asylum and Andrew Haswell Green laid to rest as a civic martyr, New York told itself the story was finished. It was not. The city had resolved the crime legally, but it had not resolved the discomfort it exposed. Beneath the official conclusion, mistaken identity, mental illness, tragic coincidence, lingered an unease that no verdict could quiet, because the murder had revealed something the city preferred not to see: that power, when exercised quietly and without accountability, did not remain contained, that private arrangements had public consequences, and that the people most likely to suffer those consequences were rarely the ones who benefited from the arrangements in the first place. Andrew Haswell Green had been the wrong man, but the fear he represented was the right one. He was a symbol of order, of planning, civics, rationality. His death suggested that even the most carefully designed systems could be punctured by forces they did not acknowledge. The city mourned him not only because he was respected, but because his murder unsettled the illusion that New York was fully in control of itself. That illusion mattered, so the narrative hardened. Williams was declared insane, and therefore unknowable. His motives were no longer required to make sense. The chain of events that led him to that doorstep was cut cleanly at the point of diagnosis. Everything before it became irrelevant. In this version of events, no one else bore responsibility. Not the landlord who evicted him. Not the man who used aliases and moved quietly through other people's homes. Not the structures that allowed humiliation to accumulate without relief. The city exhaled and moved on. But for those who lived closer to the margins, those who understood how fragile stability truly was, the lesson lingered. Hannah Elias understood it immediately. The murder did not implicate her legally, but it clarified the environment she occupied. It showed her how easily her carefully constructed life could intersect with chaos she neither caused nor controlled. How proximity, not guilt, could drag a person into catastrophe. The fact that her name had surfaced only briefly in connection with the case did not reassure her. It warned her. New York had shown her how stories were handled when they grew inconvenient. Complexity was flattened, responsibility was narrowed, and people who did not fit cleanly into the city's self-image were erased from the narrative as efficiently as they were introduced. She had been spared this time. She did not assume she would be spared again as the years passed. Hannah watched how the Green murder receded into abstraction. It became a trivia question, a historical footnote. Williams became a caricature of madness. The deeper connections, the housing, the evictions, the aliases, the quiet movements of powerful men were left unexplored. That pattern was familiar. It was the same pattern she had seen in her own scandal. When evidence failed to produce condemnation, implication stepped in. When implication became uncomfortable, silence followed. New York did not seek truth. It sought equilibrium, and equilibrium was easiest to restore when the burden fell on those least equipped to resist it. Hannah Elias had resisted once, through silence, discipline, and law, but resistance required energy, and the cost of staying alert, guarded, and prepared grew heavier with time. The Green murder reinforced a decision she had already begun to consider. Distance was not cowardice, it was strategy. The city that had given her opportunity had also revealed its limits. It could accommodate her wealth, but not her autonomy. It could tolerate her success, but not her refusal to perform guilt or gratitude. It could absorb her story, but only by distorting it beyond recognition. And when things went wrong, as they inevitably did, the city protected itself first. Andrew Haswell Green had died because a man misidentified him. Cornelius Williams had lost his life to confinement because his grievances found no outlet. And Hannah Elias had learned, once again, that when systems failed, the fallout landed far from the centers of power. She did not mourn the city. She assessed it. By the time New York entered the second decade of the 20th century, Hannah Elias had already begun to step away, emotionally, socially, strategically. The murder was not the cause of her departure, but it was confirmation. A final data point in a life shaped by pattern recognition. New York was not dangerous because it was chaotic. It was dangerous because it normalized consequences without accountability. And Hannah Elias had no intention of being present the next time the city needed someone else to carry its unease. The decision to leave was no longer abstract. It was inevitable. And when she finally disappeared from New York streets, the city would barely notice at first, but the absence would echo longer than anyone expected, because it would mark the quiet exit of a woman who had seen the machinery clearly and chosen not to be crushed by it. By the time New York began to celebrate Harlem as a rising center of Black prosperity, Hannah Elias had already learned what visibility demanded in return. The 1910s brought change to the city, north of Central Park. Streets once dominated by older white families began to shift. Black professionals moved in, doctors, lawyers, real estate investors, artists, drawn by opportunity and community. Churches expanded. Businesses opened. A new confidence took root. To many, it felt like arrival. To Hannah, It felt like exposure. On paper, she should have been at the center of it all. She owned property in Harlem before its transformation. She understood real estate better than most newcomers. She had capital, experience, and foresight. She could have become a visible patron, a public figure, even a leader. She chose none of it. Hannah's relationship with respectability was complicated. She understood its power, but she also understood its price. Respectability did not protect people like her. It regulated them. It came with expectations, visibility, explanation, performance, and Hannah had spent too much of her life paying for other people's comfort. So while Harlem grew louder, Hannah grew quieter. She participated economically but avoided social prominence. She bought and sold land, negotiated leases, and made calculated decisions that aligned with long-term value rather than public recognition. Her name appeared on documents, not invitations. Her influence moved through contracts, not speeches. Those who encountered her during this period described a woman who was deliberate to the point of reserve. She did not linger in conversation. She did not trade in optimism or nostalgia. She spoke about business plainly and ended meetings promptly. This was not aloofness. It was boundary. The memory of 1904 had not faded for her. If anything, time had sharpened its lesson. She remembered how quickly admiration turned into scrutiny, how success invited questions no one else had to answer, how wealth in the wrong hands was treated as provocation. Harlem's rise did not erase those dynamics. It amplified them as Black success became more visible. Backlash followed close behind. Newspapers that praised progress one week warned of danger the next. Politicians spoke of improvement while quietly reinforcing barriers. The city congratulated itself publicly and policed its comfort privately. Hannah watched this with clear eyes. She had no interest in becoming a symbol of progress or of fear. Symbols were useful until they were sacrificed. She had already seen how quickly a narrative could be weaponized, so she positioned herself just outside the spotlight. She moved residences again. Choosing anonymity over prestige, she reduced her public footprint. Even her circle narrowed, trusted servants, a handful of legal and financial contacts, and little else. This withdrawal was not retreat. It was refinement. Hannah Elias had spent decades learning how systems responded to pressure. She understood that power was safest when it was boring, when it attracted no commentary, no myth-making, no curiosity. And she understood something else as well. New York had never truly forgiven her, not because she had done wrong, but because she had survived scrutiny without submitting to it. That kind of survival made people uneasy. As the decade progressed, small legal threats began to surface. Old associates raised questions. Distant relatives of John R. Platt hinted at unresolved grievances. None of it amounted to formal action. But Hannah recognized the pattern. Noise before pursuit. Speculation before pressure. She had seen it before. The city did not need to win in court to exhaust someone. It only needed to keep them within reach. Hannah began to think beyond New York. Not as fantasy, but as calculation. She assessed distance the way she assessed risk, methodically, without sentiment. Europe offered insulation. Jurisdictions shifted. Memory thinned. Identities blurred. Wealth traveled more easily than reputation. France, in particular, appealed to her. There, she would not be required to explain herself in American terms. She would not be measured against American anxieties about race, morality, or propriety. She would simply be another foreign woman of means, noticed, perhaps, but not interrogated. The idea settled slowly, then firmly. Hannah Elias had spent her life adapting to systems that never fully accepted her. She had learned to extract what she needed without believing their promises. Now, she recognized the final phase of that adaptation. Leaving was not failure. It was completion. And as Harlem surged forward, full of voices and visibility, Hannah Elias quietly prepared for an exit that would leave behind no manifesto, only absence. The city would barely register it at first, but her decision had already been made. Decisions, for Hannah Elias, were never sudden. They arrived after long observation, after patterns repeated often enough to become undeniable. She did not mistake restlessness for insight, nor fear for clarity. When she chose, it was because the alternative had already proven itself untenable. By the early 1920s, New York had done that. The city no longer pursued her openly. It did not need to. Its pressure was ambient, present in the glances that lingered too long, the questions that arrived disguised as pleasantries, the business dealings that now required unnecessary explanation. The scandal was old, but its residue remained active. Hannah understood residue. It was what remained when punishment failed, but resentment did not. When law closed a matter, but society refused to, she continued to live well. Her finances were solid, her properties performed. From the outside, there was no reason to leave. That, in fact, was what made leaving possible. Only those who are secure can afford to disappear. Hannah began quietly restructuring her life. The process was meticulous. Assets were consolidated, not liquidated wholesale. Some properties were sold, others transferred into arrangements that required minimal oversight. She avoided moves that would raise curiosity or invite commentary. Nothing announced itself. Even her daily habits shifted subtly. She reduced engagements, limited correspondence, delegated more. Her home became quieter, more efficient, less personal. What could not be carried forward was pared away. People noticed the change without understanding it. To acquaintances, Hannah seemed increasingly private. To business contacts, increasingly distant. No one confronted her about it. New York was accustomed to people withdrawing into themselves, especially people who had learned the cost of being known. The only person fully aware of her intentions was Cato. Her butler had served her long enough to recognize preparation when he saw it. He did not ask questions. He simply adjusted. Arrangements were made, records organized, logistics handled with the same discretion that had defined his service. When Hannah finally spoke to him about Europe, it was not a conversation so much as a confirmation. France, Paris, first, then the South. No timetable announced, no finality emphasized, just direction. Cato accepted without comment. The decision to leave was not fueled by bitterness. Hannah did not frame it as escape. She felt no need to dramatize her relationship with New York or settle accounts with the city that had shaped her. She had already extracted what she needed from it: experience, capital, clarity. What remained was cost. The longer she stayed, the more she risked being pulled back into narratives she did not control. Old accusations could be revived, new ones invented. The city had a long memory for discomfort and an even longer appetite for spectacle. Hannah had outgrown both. There was also a subtler consideration, one she rarely articulated even to herself: age. She was no longer the young woman who had arrived in New York with nothing but instinct and adaptability. She had survived decades by staying alert, by reading rooms carefully, by anticipating shifts before they arrived. That vigilance had sustained her, but it had also demanded constant attention. Europe promised something else. Not innocence, not safety, but rest. In Paris, she could be ordinary in a way New York never allowed her to be. Her money would precede her, but her story would not. She would not be asked to represent progress or provoke fear. She would not be forced into moral roles she never volunteered for. She would simply live. As the months passed, the decision hardened into certainty. Hannah felt no urgency, only resolve. She selected her departure window carefully, choosing a moment when attention elsewhere was loud enough to mask her absence. By 1923, everything was ready. There were no farewells, no last looks over the city skyline. Hannah had never been sentimental about places that required her vigilance to survive. She believed in forward motion, not retrospection. When the day came, she left as she had lived, quietly. New York did not mark her departure. There were no notices in the papers, no rumors that traveled faster than fact. A few people would later realize she was gone. But by then, it no longer mattered. The city had already replaced her with other stories. Hannah Elias stepped onto the ship with the same composure she brought to every threshold. She did not frame the moment as an ending. It was a transition, and for the first time in her adult life, it was a transition she did not have to explain to anyone. What awaited her across the ocean was not reinvention. It was permission to exist without annotation. And that, to Hannah Elias, was worth more than any fortune she had ever acquired. The ship carried Hannah Elias away from New York without ceremony. Days passed measured by the rhythm of the sea, monotonous, steady, indifferent. On board, she kept to herself. She was courteous but distant, uninterested in conversation that invited biography. To fellow passengers, she was simply an American woman of means traveling abroad, accompanied by a quiet, efficient servant. No one asked questions. That anonymity felt unfamiliar at first. For decades, Hannah had lived under the weight of interpretation, even in silence. She had been read, judged, theorized. Now, surrounded by strangers who lacked the context to speculate, she experienced something close to relief. Europe did not know her story. When she arrived in Paris, the city greeted her with indifference, a gift she had long desired. Paris was accustomed to foreigners, to wealth, to women who lived independently. It did not require justification or narrative. It asked only that one pay, behave, and move on. Hannah rented discreetly at first. She walked the streets without destination. She observed cafes, markets, and public gardens not as symbols, but as ordinary spaces meant to be used rather than interpreted. The city's scale, its density of life, allowed her to blend rather than stand apart. She did not seek community. She sought quiet. Over time, she traveled south. Accounts differ on where she settled. Some place her in Nice, others in Cannes. Still others insist she preferred smaller coastal towns where privacy came easily and attention dispersed quickly. What matters is not the address, but the pattern. Hannah chose places that asked little of her. Her days grew smaller, more contained. She read, she walked, she managed her finances through intermediaries. Cato remained at her side, a constant presence who understood routine without instruction. There was no reinvention, no dramatic shedding of identity. Hannah did not become someone else in Europe. She simply stopped being required to explain who she already was. That absence of pressure changed the texture of her life. The vigilance that had once been constant softened. She no longer needed to anticipate accusation or interpret every glance. The world still contained prejudice, hierarchy, and power, but it was not her battlefield anymore. Her health, by most accounts, remained stable for years. She lived comfortably, neither ostentatiously nor frugally. She did not seek publicity, and publicity did not seek her. Slowly, she faded from American consciousness. Back in New York, memory thinned. New scandals replaced old ones. New fortunes rose and fell. Harlem's cultural explosion captured headlines and imagination. The city's appetite for story moved on. Hannah Elias became a rumor, a name occasionally invoked when discussing scandal or power, but rarely examined in full. Writers condensed her life into anecdotes. Moralists simplified her into lesson. Historians argued over details that mattered less than meaning. No definitive record marked her death. Some sources claimed she died in Paris in the late 1920s. Others insisted she lived longer, enjoying the Riviera until age finally slowed her. Documentation is inconclusive, intentional. Perhaps Hannah Elias had spent a lifetime navigating visibility and consequence. It would not be surprising if she ensured that even her ending resisted clarity. What remains is not a clean narrative arc, but a residue, questions that refuse to settle. Was she a victim of circumstance or an architect of opportunity? Was she exceptional or merely honest about how power actually functioned? Did she exploit a system, or did she reveal one already built on exploitation? The answers depend less on Hannah than on the person asking. What is certain is this: Hannah Elias did not ask for absolution. She did not seek vindication through confession. She did not attempt to control how history would remember her. She chose something more radical. She chose to leave. In doing so, she denied society the satisfaction of judgment. She denied it a tidy conclusion, a moral endpoint. She allowed the story to remain unresolved, forcing those who encountered it to confront their own assumptions about power, race, gender, and consent. Hannah Elias lived long enough to understand that history rarely tells the truth. It tells what is convenient. By disappearing, she refused to be made convenient. Her life remains what it always was: difficult to categorize, impossible to simplify, and resistant to the narratives imposed upon it. A woman born at the end of a war, a survivor of institutions that promised fairness and delivered conditions, a strategist who understood silence as leverage, and in the end, a figure who proved that the final act of autonomy is not domination, but withdrawal. Not every life leaves a monument. Some leave a question, and Hannah Elias left one that New York and America has never fully answered. Even after Hannah Elias vanished from New York, the city was not finished with her. Stories rarely end when the central figure leaves. More often, they linger, reshaped by those who remain behind and still feel unsettled by what they cannot control. Hannah's absence created space, and into that space poured speculation, resentment, and unfinished business. The scandal of 1904 did not fade cleanly into history. It hardened. Lawyers continued to discuss it in low tones. Journalists revisited it whenever questions of morality, wealth, or race surfaced. And within the Platt family, the wound never fully closed. To them, the verdict had not been justice. It had been failure. They could not accept that such a vast portion of John R. Platt's fortune had left the family permanently transformed into property, security, and autonomy for a woman they believed should never have possessed it. The law had spoken. Yes, but law and legitimacy were not the same thing in their minds. They believed something had been taken, and if it could not be retrieved through criminal court, then it must be pursued elsewhere, through civil pressure, social narrative, and time. Even after Platt's death in 1908, the idea persisted that the story had ended incorrectly, that the wrong lesson had been learned, that Hannah Elias had escaped accountability not because she was innocent, but because she had been clever. This belief survived without evidence. In its place grew something more durable: grievance. In legal circles, Hannah's case became an example frequently cited but rarely examined closely. It was described as a technical outcome, a failure of proof, a peculiarity of circumstance. These phrases softened what was actually true, that the law had found no wrongdoing because none could be demonstrated. The distinction mattered, because admitting that fact required confronting an uncomfortable possibility, that power, desire, and money had flowed exactly as intended, without coercion, and that the outrage stemmed not from illegality, but from outcome. A Black woman had ended up wealthy, and no one had been able to stop it. Over the years, attempts were made, quiet ones, to reopen questions around Hannah's finances. None succeeded. Documentation was solid, transfers were legitimate, properties were properly acquired, taxes were paid. Every avenue closed where it touched evidence. What could not be challenged legally was challenged narratively. Hannah's story was reframed again and again. Sometimes she was depicted as predatory, sometimes as manipulative, sometimes as dangerously intelligent. The details shifted to suit the discomfort of the moment. What remained consistent was the refusal to accept her autonomy at face value. She was always something else. This reframing served a social purpose. It reassured those unsettled by the case that order had not truly been disrupted, that Hannah's success was aberration, not implication, that no broader lesson needed to be learned. But beneath these retellings lay a quieter truth. The lawsuit had failed not because the law was weak, but because it had worked as designed. It had demanded proof rather than outrage. It had examined action rather than assumption. And that, perhaps, was what made the case so difficult to let go. Hannah Elias had forced the system to look at itself. In doing so, she had exposed a gap between moral expectation and legal reality, a gap many preferred not to acknowledge. As the years passed, the city's relationship with the scandal shifted from anger to myth. Hannah became less a person and more an idea, invoked selectively, stripped of context, and used to support arguments she would never have recognized. She was cited in debates about blackmail laws, about women's influence, about racial anxiety. Rarely was she discussed as a full human being shaped by conditions, choices, and constraints. That flattening was its own kind of erasure. And yet, even as the story was distorted, something stubborn remained. The fact that Hannah Elias had never been convicted, the fact that no court had compelled her to return the money, the fact that she had walked away intact. Those facts resisted revision. They lingered like a quiet rebuke to the narratives built around them. In legal textbooks, her case remained anomalous, in public memory, unresolved, in private conversation, unsettling, because it suggested that sometimes the system did exactly what it was meant to do, and people simply did not like the result. Hannah Elias never responded to these aftershocks, from wherever she lived in France. She remained unreachable. No interviews, no statements, no clarifications. She did not correct errors or reclaim her story. Her silence denied critics the final confrontation they craved. And in that denial lay its own power. As New York continued to modernize, celebrating progress while quietly reinforcing hierarchy, the shadow of the Hannah Elias case persisted. It surfaced whenever wealth crossed boundaries without permission, whenever intimacy complicated power, whenever a woman refused to play the role assigned to her. The lawsuit had ended years ago, but its implications had not, and they would follow the city far longer than Hannah Elias ever did. As the years moved further away from 1904, something curious happened to the Hannah Elias case. It stopped being discussed as a legal matter and started being discussed as a moral failure. Not her failure, the system's, among New York's elite. The verdict became shorthand for unease. It was cited in conversations where no one wanted to speak plainly, when fortunes vanished inexplicably, when private indulgences became public liabilities. When men discovered that discretion, once paid for, could not be reclaimed as innocence, the law had refused to punish Hannah Elias. That refusal haunted people in respectable circles. There was a quiet insistence that the courts had been too literal, that they had demanded proof where common sense should have sufficed, that technicalities had overridden morality. This language mattered. It reframed justice as an inconvenience rather than a safeguard. It suggested that outcomes should align with expectation, not evidence, and beneath it all lay an unspoken premise that someone like Hannah Elias should not have been allowed to win. She had not fit the template of acceptable success. The discomfort sharpened as new generations of Black Americans began to accumulate wealth more visibly. Harlem's rise challenged old assumptions. Black-owned businesses flourished. Professionals demanded recognition. Cultural influence surged. And threaded through these conversations was a familiar anxiety. What if Hannah Elias was not an anomaly? What if she was simply early? For those invested in hierarchy, that possibility was intolerable. So the story hardened again, this time into warning. Newspapers and popular histories framed Hannah as a cautionary tale about unchecked female influence, about the dangers of secrecy, about the vulnerability of men to manipulation. Her race was mentioned more openly now, often under the guise of sociological curiosity. The narrative shifted blame without evidence. Hannah became proof that something had gone wrong, not legally, but socially, that norms had been violated even if statutes had not. This framing allowed critics to condemn her without reopening the case, without challenging the verdict, without confronting the facts. It was safer to argue morality than legality. And yet, even this reframing could not fully erase the core problem. Hannah Elias had not been forced to give anything back. She had not been publicly disgraced. She had not apologized. She had simply left. That exit, clean, quiet, uncompromising, robbed critics of closure. There was no final scene in which she was humbled or redeemed. No confession to soften outrage. No downfall to restore balance. She remained unresolved. In legal scholarship, the case continued to surface in discussions of Black male law. It was cited as an example of the distinction between pressure and coercion, between moral discomfort and criminal conduct. Professors used it to illustrate how difficult it was to prosecute emotional leverage without concrete threat. Students found the case frustrating. They wanted villains. Instead, they found transactions. They wanted justice to feel intuitive. Instead, they found precision. That tension mirrored the public response. People wanted the law to validate their instincts. When it did not, they blamed the law or the woman who had benefited from its clarity. Rarely did they question the instincts themselves. As decades passed, Hannah Elias's name became increasingly abstract. Fewer people remembered the details. More people remembered the feeling, the sense that something improper had occurred without consequence. That feeling proved durable. It surfaced whenever conversations turned to gendered power dynamics, to interracial relationships cloaked in discretion, to wealth that crossed lines without explanation. Hannah became a reference point not because she was understood, but because she was unresolved, and unresolved figures are useful. They can be shaped to fit the anxieties of the moment. What no retelling could escape, however, was the stubborn presence of fact. No matter how often her motives were questioned, no matter how darkly her character was shaded, the record remained unchanged. She had been accused. She had been investigated. She had been jailed briefly. and she had been released without charge. The money had stayed with her. That reality forced a choice upon those who revisited the case. Either accept that the law had functioned correctly, even if uncomfortably, or insist that justice had failed, without being able to explain how. Exactly. It should have succeeded. Most chose the second option. It required less introspection. From France. Hannah Elias remained silent through all of it. She did not correct distortions. She did not defend herself against posthumous reinterpretation. She allowed the story to move without her, confident perhaps that truth did not require maintenance, or perhaps she simply understood that once a narrative reached a certain scale, participation only fed it. Her absence turned the case into something stranger than scandal. It became a mirror, a reflection of what society expected punishment to look like, and how unsettled it became when punishment did not arrive on schedule. In that sense, Hannah Elias continued to trouble New York long after she left it. Not by what she did, but by what the city could not make her do. There are victories that are celebrated, and then there are victories that offend. Hannah Elias's was the second kind, by every legal measure. She had prevailed. The courts had rejected the accusation of blackmail. Civil claims had failed. No money was returned. No wrongdoing was proven. She had endured arrest, detention, and public humiliation, and emerged legally intact. Yet nothing about the outcome satisfied the public appetite for resolution, because Hannah's victory did not look the way people expected justice to look. She was not absolved through repentance. She was not spared through sympathy. She was not redeemed by suffering. She simply remained, wealthy, silent, uncorrected. For many, that was intolerable. In the years following the case, a quiet resentment hardened around her name. It did not shout, it whispered. It appeared in editorials that questioned whether the law could truly address moral crimes. It surfaced in conversations where people insisted that everyone knew what had really happened, even if no one could prove it. This was not about evidence. It was about expectation. The expectation that power flowed in one direction. The expectation that women, especially Black women, did not exit scandals with autonomy intact. The expectation that men of status were entitled to regret without consequence. Hannah Elias violated all three. Her silence was read not as restraint, but as defiance. Her refusal to explain herself angered those who believed explanation was owed, and her decision to leave the country only deepened suspicion. As though departure itself were an admission, rather than a strategic withdrawal from a hostile environment, people wanted a lesson. Hannah refused to provide one, so others supplied it for her. In popular retellings, she became exaggerated. Her intelligence sharpened into cunning, her discipline into coldness, her privacy into secrecy. Each version made her easier to dismiss and easier to fear. The real Hannah, measured, cautious, shaped by institutions that punished missteps disproportionately, was less convenient, and convenience mattered more than truth. What unsettled critics most was not that Hannah had taken advantage of a system, but that she had done so without breaking it. She had operated within the boundaries of legality, even as she challenged social norms that relied on those boundaries being selectively enforced. She had not forced John R. Platt to give her money. She had allowed him to. That distinction stripped away a comforting narrative of victimhood. It suggested that power could be exercised through desire and discretion just as effectively as through threats, and that those who wielded it might later resent the outcome. This implication was deeply destabilizing. It reframed the scandal not as an aberration, but as exposure of how often private arrangements contradicted public morality, how frequently wealth changed hands without oversight, how easily society ignored those transactions until the recipient violated an unspoken rule about who was allowed to benefit. Hannah Elias did not invent hypocrisy. She revealed it. That revelation lingered. In law schools, her case continued to provoke debate, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear. It demonstrated how limited the reach of criminal law truly was, and how uncomfortable people became when the law refused to perform moral theater. Students asked why blackmail was so hard to prove. Professors explained coercion, intent, and evidence. But beneath those explanations lay another question no syllabus could address. Why did so many people want her to lose? The answer was never legal. It was cultural. It was racial. It was gendered. It was rooted in an assumption that some outcomes, however lawful, were unacceptable. Hannah Elias had reached one of those outcomes. She had lived long enough to understand that outrage did not always seek correction. Sometimes, it sought reassurance that the world still worked the way people believed it should. Her story denied that reassurance by leaving New York and refusing to engage with her own mythology. Hannah ensured that the discomfort would not resolve itself through confrontation. There would be no final exchange of words, no public reckoning, no mutual understanding, only absence. And absence has a way of amplifying what people cannot let go. In the end, Hannah Elias did not win because she defeated her opponents. She won because she outlasted them. She allowed time to do what argument never could, expose how quickly certainty decayed when unsupported by fact. New York moved on, as cities always do. But it carried the faint imprint of her presence, like a pressure point that never quite stopped aching. Her victory was not loud, it was not celebrated, but it was enduring. And perhaps that was what angered people most of all. Long after Hannah Elias had left New York, long after the courtrooms emptied and the headlines yellowed, the city continued to argue with her in her absence. It did not argue about facts. Those had been settled. It argued about meaning. New York is a city built on stories it tells itself. Stories about merit, ambition, fairness, and consequence. Hannah Elias disrupted those stories not by rejecting them outright, but by passing through them without accepting their moral conclusions. She worked. She adapted. She accumulated. She complied with the law. And still, she emerged somewhere society had not planned for her to be. That was the offense. If Hannah Elias had been punished, the city could have absorbed her story easily. Punishment would have confirmed order. It would have restored balance. It would have reassured everyone that the system ultimately corrected itself. But she was not punished. She was released. And that release? Quiet, procedural, unceremonious, left New York with a problem it could not resolve. Because if Hannah Elias had done nothing illegal, then the outrage had never truly been about crime. It had been about comfort. Comfort with who held money. Comfort with who exercised autonomy. Comfort with who was allowed to benefit from discretion without apology. In this light, the scandal of 1904 was less a legal drama than a cultural stress test, and New York failed it. The city never forgave Hannah Elias because forgiveness implies wrongdoing. And to admit she had done nothing wrong required confronting something far more unsettling, that the system had functioned exactly as designed. And people simply did not like the outcome. That realization lingered quietly through the decades. It surfaced in debates about respectability, in anxieties over Black wealth, in suspicions toward women who moved through power without visible dependency. Hannah became a reference point, a cautionary echo invoked whenever someone crossed an invisible boundary without asking permission. And yet, outside of New York, her story lost its sharp edges. In Europe, she was not a scandal. She was not a symbol. She was not an argument. She was a woman living the remainder of her life on terms she had selected carefully and defended relentlessly. That contrast mattered. It revealed how much of the outrage surrounding Hannah Elias had been local, rooted not in universal principles, but in a city's particular fears about itself. New York feared what it could not categorize. It feared outcomes that did not reinforce hierarchy. It feared women who did not need absolution. Hannah Elias embodied all three. The city also feared something else, something harder to articulate. It feared precedent. Because if Hannah Elias could survive scandal without submission, then others might follow. Others might learn the same lessons about silence, legality, and withdrawal. Others might refuse to perform guilt when none could be proven. That possibility unsettled the narrative of control New York relied upon. And so, rather than accept Hannah's outcome as legitimate, the city preserved its discomfort, allowing the story to remain unresolved, half condemned, half forgotten. In doing so, it ensured that Hannah Elias would remain present precisely because she was absent. Her legacy was not wealth, it was tension. A tension between law and morality, between evidence and expectation, between who society believed deserved autonomy and who it did not. Hannah Elias did not seek to leave behind a lesson. She left behind a question. What happens when the system works, and people still feel wronged? New York never answered that question. Instead, it moved on, faster, louder, more confident than before, carrying the quiet discomfort of a woman it could neither punish nor fully ignore. And that discomfort would echo far beyond her lifetime. History prefers order. It prefers lives that move cleanly from cause to consequence, from transgression to punishment, from struggle to redemption. When a life refuses that arc, history grows uneasy. It trims edges. It simplifies. It mislabels. Hannah Elias resisted every category history tried to assign her. She was not a criminal, no matter how often that word hovered near her name. She was not a heroine. She never claimed virtue or sacrifice. She was not a victim. She refused to center her life around injury. She existed in a space that made people uncomfortable. Competence without apology. For decades after her disappearance, historians struggled to decide what to do with her. Some reduced her to a footnote in the Platt scandal. Others sensationalized her as a femme fatale, exaggerating her influence until it became almost mythic. Still others treated her as an anomaly, interesting, but isolated, safely detached from broader patterns. All of these approaches shared a flaw. They treated Hannah Elias as an exception rather than a product. She was shaped by Reconstruction America, by the narrow economic paths available to Black women, by a justice system that punished intent less than visibility. She learned early that survival depended not on innocence, but on precision, that discretion was currency, that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, could be power. These were not unique insights. They were simply rarely acknowledged. What made Hannah Elias difficult for history to place was not what she did, but what she did not do. She did not confess. She did not repent. She did not explain herself in terms that made others comfortable. She denied historians the raw material they rely on: testimony, reflection, moral framing. Without those, her life could not be easily interpreted as cautionary or inspirational. It remained opaque, and opacity frustrates narratives built on certainty. Even modern retellings struggle with her. Writers oscillate between admiration and suspicion, often in the same paragraph. They praise her intelligence, then question her ethics. They acknowledge her legality, then hint at impropriety. The tension never resolves, because resolving it would require confronting an uncomfortable truth: that Hannah Elias may have understood the system more honestly than those who condemned her. She did not pretend the world was fair. She did not assume virtue guaranteed protection. She did not confuse legality with morality, or morality with social approval. She navigated the gap between those concepts with care, not illusion. That navigation unsettled people then, and it unsettles them now. History often demands that marginalized figures justify their outcomes, to prove they deserved survival, wealth, autonomy. Hannah Elias refused that burden. She did not argue that she was exceptional. She acted as though she was entitled to the same strategic choices as anyone else. That refusal remains radical, in the absence of her own words. Others filled the silence, but none of those voices carried her authority. They speculated, inferred, projected. They argued about her motives while revealing more about their own assumptions than about her reality. What Hannah Elias left behind was not a clear message. It was a disruption of the idea that power must always announce itself, a disruption of the belief that punishment is inevitable, a disruption of the narrative that survival requires public absolution. Her life suggested something far more unsettling, that sometimes the most effective response to unjust scrutiny is not resistance or compliance, but withdrawal. History is still learning how to sit with that idea, because withdrawal does not create martyrs. It does not create villains. It does not create lessons that fit cleanly into textbooks. It creates absence, and absence forces reflection. Hannah Elias did not ask to be remembered correctly. She seemed to understand that remembrance itself was a negotiation she did not wish to enter. By leaving, by remaining silent, by allowing ambiguity to stand, she protected the only thing she had always guarded carefully, her autonomy. In that sense, her final act was consistent with her entire life. She refused to let others finish her story for her, and history, deprived of closure, has been arguing with that refusal ever since. In the end, Hannah Elias did not leave behind a legacy in the way history usually understands the word. There was no foundation bearing her name, no memoir clarifying her motives, no final speech to anchor interpretation. What she left behind was something far more difficult to contain. A question. It is tempting to ask whether Hannah Elias was good or bad, innocent or guilty, victim or manipulator. Those questions feel natural because they offer resolution. They promise moral balance, an ending where judgment restores order. But Hannah's life refuses that structure. She did not live in a world governed by fairness, only by consequence. From the moment she was arrested for borrowing a dress, she understood that intent mattered less than perception, and that perception was shaped by power. Every choice she made afterward reflected that understanding. She learned to survive not by demanding justice, but by anticipating its absence. That is what makes her story endure. Hannah Elias forces an uncomfortable confrontation with how societies actually function, not how they claim to function. She reveals that legality and morality are not twins, that discretion can be purchased, and that silence can be as strategic as speech. She exposes how often outrage is less about harm than about violated expectations, and she asks something more unsettling still. What if the system didn't fail? What if the courts did exactly what they were designed to do? Evaluate evidence, not emotion, and people simply could not accept the outcome? If that is true, then the scandal of 1904 was never about blackmail. It was about control. Control over narrative, control over reputation, control over who was allowed to benefit from private arrangements without public shame. Hannah Elias stepped outside that control without breaking the law. And that was unforgivable. Her story also complicates ideas of empowerment. She was not liberated by benevolence, nor saved by institutions. She did not defeat her circumstances through moral purity. She navigated them through clarity, sometimes at great personal cost. There is no evidence that her life was easy. There is no proof that her choices were painless. What there is, instead, is consistency. She adapted when punished. She invested when allowed. She withdrew when exposure became dangerous. She did not confuse endurance with virtue or suffering with meaning. And when the balance shifted decisively against her, she left. That departure, quiet, final, unapologetic, was her last assertion of agency. It denied the city the spectacle it craved. It denied history the neat conclusion it prefers. It denied critics the satisfaction of a reckoning. Hannah Elias did not seek to be understood. She sought to be free, today. When her story resurfaces, it does so because the questions it raises have not gone away. We still struggle with how power operates behind closed doors. We still argue about consent, coercion, and the boundaries between them. We still react viscerally when wealth appears in places we did not expect it to be. And we are still unsettled when someone survives scrutiny without submitting to it. Hannah Elias stands at that intersection, between legality and discomfort, between autonomy and suspicion. She reminds us that systems are not judged only by who they punish, but by who they cannot. History may never fully place her, but perhaps that is the point. Some lives are not meant to be resolved into lessons. Some stories exist to expose the limits of our frameworks, to show us where our instincts fail, where our moral shortcuts collapse. Hannah Elias lived beyond those shortcuts. She left behind no monument, no confession, no redemption arc, only a life that insists, quietly and stubbornly, on being taken as it was. And a question that remains, long after the headlines faded and the city moved on. What does justice look like when the outcome makes us uncomfortable, but the evidence leaves us no one to blame?